Hey guys! Tonight, we step into the hushed corridors of a Ming Dynasty palace kitchen, where dawn's first light filters through latticed windows, igniting motes of dust that dance above rows of gleaming copper pots. And you probably won't survive this if you can't handle a little petal perfume wafting into your nostrils. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop your location and local time in the comments so I can imagine where you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across smooth marble floors, the morning hush, broken only by the distant rhythmic thwack of wooden paddles stirring vats of broth. In this realm, eunuchs scurry like shadowy puppeteers orchestrating the palace's culinary symphony. Traders deliver baskets brimming with freshly harvested peony blossoms, their petals still kissed with dew. You inhale the sweet floral aroma that mingles with the sizzling of meat and crackle of embers, an olfactory overture that tells you this is no ordinary breakfast. Listen closely. Eunuchs lean over wicker baskets, plucking pale pink and deep crimson petals with nimble fingers, sorting them by size and fragrance. One eunuch hums a chant meant to coax the petals' oils outward, a quirky notion. Some claim that humming at 528 hertz, the love frequency go figure enhances floral fragrance. Skeptics roll their eyes, but you can't deny the petal-scented steam that curls from the steaming rice, promising sensory delight. Historians still argue whether such chants served a spiritual purpose or were simply ritualized routine. Some suggest those melodies echoed Buddhist sutras, while others say it was shown to be a mnemonic device to ensure consistent petal drying. Feel the early sun warm your cheeks as an elder eunuch stooped in russet robes taps a slender wooden ladle against a porcelain bowl engraved with dragon motifs. The gentle clink resonates like a heartbeat. He tilts his head as though conversing with the petals, then flicks a cluster into a shallow dish of salted water, just enough to remove any lingering dust. You recall that mainstream historical fact during the Chenghua Emperor's reign, 1464-1487. Official court records note that peony petals were an established seasoning in imperial cuisine prized for their aroma and claimed digestive benefits. You might roll your eyes and think sure petals to aid digestion because a bowl of petals definitely soothes a grumbling stomach. But there it is recorded in the Ming Gongjing Lu, the precise palace protocols. A nearby eunuch in teal robes carries a wooden bucket of boiling oil steam rising in lazy curls as he lowers a ladle to test the temperature. He mutters another chant under his breath, sweet as the peony's sigh, he says with a wry smile, before gently frying a single petal until its edges lace with gold. That fried petal, they claim, imparts an umami-savvy kiss to the emperor's morning noodles. You might laugh thinking, breaking news. Crispy peony petals rank higher than bacon in imperial taste tests, but the court's tasting notes extol the subtle floral accent, describing it as like a soft spring breeze that lifts the heart. Historians still argue whether peony frying was widespread or a fleeting fad among palace gourmands. Some evidence hints that only a handful of chief chefs truly mastered the technique. You step closer to the hearth, where two eunuchs clad in indigo robes, sly copper sight glasses, under a simmering pot. The pale pink petals bob on the surface, releasing floral steam that dances toward the rafters. One eunuch kneels, lowering his face to peer inside. Must be a serious sniff test. You think, if you can't sniff petals without ruining your nose, you probably shouldn't be in charge of seasoning. But nonetheless, that steam guides their decision. More petals. Less a peppermint leaf here. The men humanely test each bowl with graceful nudges of their ladles. Meanwhile, a younger eunuch hustles by, balancing a tray of porcelain bowls painted in cobalt and gold. Each bowl cradles a delicate broth of simmered peony petals and lily bulb, a blend said to soothe the emperor's morning chills. A quirky fringe belief held that these broths could summon minor visions. If you sip too quickly, you might glimpse Zhu Yunzhang's old hunting dogs frolicking in the palace gardens. Of course, that's most likely apocryphal, but a few palace scribes swore they'd heard rustling paws where no dog had trotted for decades. Historians still argue whether such visions were hallucinatory side effects or simply metaphors for awakening senses. But palace diaries note increased meditation clarity after consuming the broth. Feel the polished wood of the dining pavilion beneath your fingertips as you peer across lacquered tables where more eunuchs arrange ornate dishes in measured patterns. Trays of jasmine-scented buns dotted with tiny peony petals sit next to porcelain spoons cradling sweet and sour peony shoots. You hear a whispered side joke. Sure, petals in buns are trending next up. Petals in palate cleansers, because nothing says digestive harmony like crunchy floral confetti. Lean in to observe an elder eunuch as he garnishes a lotus seed soup with crushed dried petal powder, just a whisper's worth that turns the broth to blush pink. He demonstrates a precise sprinkle technique, wrist flick 3 rotations, and a delicate bowl. No petal may land askew. A misplaced petal might be an affront to both gastronomy and feng shui. The eunuch glances upward as if expecting the moon goddess Chang'e to judge his handiwork. You might giggle, thinking, all right, let's just hope she's impressed and not cranky about soup seasonings. But these gestures are court-to-court etiquette, where each move carries cosmic weight. Behind the pavilion, you glimpse the peony courtyard dozen rows of bushes in various hues, white, crimson, variegated still graven, to produce next season's petals. Eunuchs patrol snipping buds at precise early hours to ensure petals remain unblemished. One eunuch in saffron balanced petals on a bamboo tray directly under the sun's first rays to dry them ever so slightly before storing. He hums that same chant you heard earlier. Some claim it keeps insects away. Historians still argue whether these melodies repelled actual pests or simply reinforced meticulous harvesting routines. But every petal that arrives in the kitchens bears the imprint of such ritual. As you return to the hearth, a flurry of activity erupts. Footmen deliver baskets of freshly steamed buns. Flame bearers stoke braziers, and eunuchs shuffle dishes to the raised dais, where the emperor's seat glimmers in mother of pearl. They prepare for the morning meal's grand debut, a spread combining crisp peony fritters shaped like lotus blossoms, petal-infused rice cakes ringed with edible flowers, and a central tureen of peony and lotus dew soup topped with a single fresh petal floating like a boat. A peal of bells echoes from the hall as the emperor arrives, robes trailing, gaze fixed on his culinary entourage. The moment of truth arrives. The eunuch in teal places the tureen before the emperor, and the whispered hush gives way to a single ah as the emperor lifts the lid, breathing in steam, fragrant with peony and lily. You see his eyes half closed, as though transported to the palace gardens at midsummer. Delightful, he murmurs, and the eunuchs bow deeply, knowing they've transported him petal by petal from bedchamber to blossom-laden arbor without ever leaving the dining pavilion. You might quip, guess petals trump roses as imperial mood lifters, but truly the layered aromas and subtle flavors send a corrective to every surly thought, soothing the most jaded mind, just as you reach for your own imaginary bowl. Let's be honest, you're craving peony-infused broth too. The tale shifts. Behind the scenes, not every eunuch agrees on recipe tweaks. One whispers to another, "Too many petals dull the broth's essence," while a rival eunuch replies, "Less petals. We might as well serve plain rice." A scholarly debate buzzes. Historians still argue whether imperial edicts dictated strict petal ratios in dishes, or if each kitchen workshop developed its own house style passed by tacit approval. Apprentices once recorded clandestine variations. Some emperors reportedly preferred extra petals for fragrance, while others wanted a more subtle floral undertone. You might chuckle, imagining an emperor demanding just a hint of peony, not a blooming garden. But these nuances shaped court cuisine. As breakfast concludes, eunuchs whisk away dishes, and the palace hovers between ritual and routine once more. You linger by the hearth, tracing the copper pots where petals once stewed, lingering echoes of petal perfume still clinging to the metal. You recall that gag stew petals long enough, and you'll start calling your teacup a peony haven. But the reality is sweeter and more delicate than any joke. Remember how you sniffed petals at dawn, how you watched crimson edges curl under oil's embrace, how the emperor inhaled that peony steam as though tasting spring itself. These palace kitchens exist at the crossroads of ritual, taste, and power, and in each petal lies a story. So as you drift to sleep, recall those soft, sweet whisperings of peony petals in ancient steam proof that even emperors find comfort in a flower's delicate embrace. You move through a courtyard ablaze with peony blooms, their sumptuous petals unfurling like silk robes against jade-green leaves, and you can almost taste their legend on your tongue. Peonies weren't always court staples. They began in folklore, where villagers believed the flower bore the spirit of spring, an ephemeral blossom that conferred good fortune. You recall that quirky tidbit some rural healers insisted peony petals steeped in warm water could calm restless dreams, dubbing it sleep's silk. Historians still argue whether that folk remedy truly eased insomnia or was simply a comforting placebo. But either way, the scent of peony tea became synonymous with peace. Walk among low stone benches where elders once whispered tales of peony as the king of flowers, commanding more reverence than lotus or orchid. In certain farming villages, families tucked fresh peony petals into harvest baskets to ensure bountiful grain offerings. The petals' rosy hues promised prosperity, so the story goes. Imagine a farmer in a russet robe, squinting under harvest sun, murmuring to each bud as though greeting an ancestral ancestor, "Bloom well, beauty, bring our fields fortune." A mainstream historical fact by the early Ming period, 1368 to 1644, botanical records indicate that peonies flourished widely in northern China, with Emperor Yongle himself commissioning gardens in Beijing named Peony Grove to showcase national pride in domestic flora. You might roll your eyes and think, because nothing says imperial power like a flower garden, yet the flower's royal moniker resonated across provinces. Picture a traveling merchant arriving at a county fair with wicker baskets brimmed with dried peony petals, trading them for silks and salt. He extols the petals' reputed ability to soften the heart, persuading matronly buyers to whisk seeds into broths for new mothers recovering childbirth. A quirk of fringe belief held that if a postpartum mother breathed petal-scented steam, her baby would dream only sweet dreams of plum blossoms. Historians still argue whether such beliefs had any medical grounding or were simply poetic additions to peony lore. But the petal's reputation for gentle healing followed them like a loyal retinue. Now see how word of peony's virtues trickles upward to the Forbidden City. Eunuchs deliver baskets of freshly plucked petals to concubines who weave them into elaborate hairpins, tiny crimson boats perched atop silk coiffures. In the women's quarters, ladies admire each other's petal ornaments, whispering, "A single petal from Mount Lu is as good as 1,000 pearls," as though peony petals were the new imperial currency. It's said that Empress Shu loved to steep petals in her daily baths, believing it preserved her porcelain complexion. Yet historians still argue whether Empress Shu was the innovator of peony-infused cosmetics or merely the most documented enthusiast of a trend already popular among court ladies. Cross to a pavilion where a pair of eunuchs in teal robes stand before a lacquered chest, its lid carved with peony blossoms in mother-of-pearl inlay. Inside, you glimpse silk pouches filled with fragrant petals reserved for the emperor's personal use. One eunuch unwraps a pouch, releases a puff of fragrance that drifts across the marble floor like a secret invitation. You might quip royal ode to peony, guaranteed to seduce even the most scarred warlord, but within this scented ritual lies a deeper truth. The emperor's table could only promise perfect flavors if the petals arrived unmarred. A mainstream historical fact in the Yongle and Zhuanda eras court edicts mandated that only petals from the imperial peony gardens, a carefully tended sanctuary north of the palace, could be used in official feasts, ensuring control over both supply and symbolism. Leaning against a carved pillar, you recall how folk poets once wrote that peony petals captured the blush of dawn, an image so vivid that northern operas began featuring peony masks during springtime festivals. When Emperor Hongwu, the founding Ming emperor, heard these verses, he ordered plantings of the most vibrant peonies in the palace grounds, commissioning eunuchs to tend the gardens as closely as they managed palace finances. That rivalry between verdant bloom and strict protocol meant eunuchs needed to master horticulture as much as cuisine. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine imperial passion or a savvy political maneuver to showcase Ming grandeur, but art and government intertwined in every petaled leaf. Step into the dynasty's central boudoir, where walls are lined with silk tapestries depicting peony fields in full splendor, reds, pinks, whites, each tone telling its own story. You remember that fringe belief? If an aspiring poet recited lines under a peony tapestry, the flowers would whisper inspiration into his dreams, gifting him stanzas fit for immortals. The court's literature circles swelled with odes to petals, each claiming that a peony petal on one's desk could summon creative genius. Yet historians still argue whether peony-inspired verse truly reflected lived beauty or was just a fashionable flourish among poets sipping fermented petal wine. Your shoes sink into polished wooden floors as you pass decorated servants carrying vases brimming with freshly cut peonies. Eunuchs escort the flowers to a secluded chamber where court alchemists distill petals into oils and powders, a marriage of botanical tradition and early chemistry. Here petals transform into exotic potions, peony oil to anoint imperial robes, fragrant masks for high-born dinners. They even experimented with petal ink, grinding dried bits into pink pigment for calligraphy scrolls. A mainstream historical fact, Ming alchemical manuals from the 15th century reference peony essences for both medicinal and decorative uses, citing recipes for petal-based ointments said to reduce fever and improve complexion. Feel the hush as you enter a dim chamber where court physicians examine a patient's complexion, prescribing a poultice of crushed peony petals and saffron to cure palace fever, a catch-all for nervous exhaustion among officials. One healer plucks a single petal, crushes it between jade rollers, and applies the paste with an iron fire tongue under flickering lamplight. He murmurs, "A single petal can still the mind's turbulence." You might chuckle thinking, a petal paste to soothe the emperor's advisors because palace politics are worse than poison. But the court journals note that these treatments often accompanied official stress relief rituals, hinting at an early understanding of botanical therapy. In the verdant peony grove, eunuchs prune blossoms at dawn, chanting, "Cut with respect, for each bud holds 1,000 blessings." Apprentices learn to recognize petals for culinary versus medicinal use, a deeper crimson petal, reserved for banquets, a paler blush for soothing teas. When a misguided apprentice once mistook the wrong cultivar, he nearly spoiled a feast's signature dish, prompting the eunuch masters to declare, "Mistake a crimson for a blush, and you'll taste your error on the emperor's tongue." Historians still argue whether such high-stakes gardening meant horticulture was as politicized as court intrigue, but that near miss earned the apprentice a season in the peony fields and undignified penance. You wander toward a pavilion where a poet official in russet robes recites ode after ode to peonies, his verses weaving floral metaphors into moral guidance. He praises the flower's ephemeral beauty, chastising officials who wither before their time, drawing parallels between petal fragility and human folly. A quirky detail: some court jesters parodied these odes, recasting peonies as floaty lute nets, mocking absurd extravagance, yet even their satire underscored peonies' cultural weight. Historians still argue whether such satirical verses were ever uttered aloud in court halls or were whispered among servants. But the presence of parody suggests that peony worship could border on obsession. As dusk deepens, you enter a moonlit garden where eunuchs gather for a petal viewing ceremony. Lanterns hang from low branches, illuminating cryptic glyphs carved into bamboo mats, each glyph corresponding to an ideal petal hue. Apprentices array petals in geometric patterns on tables, offering them to the moon as tribute. The moon sees all whispers, an elder in teal robes, and records every hue for the emperor. You shiver with reverence. A single misaligned petal might be a cosmic faux pas. A mainstream historical fact, petal viewing ceremonies were documented in Ming court diaries as seasonal events where chocolates, sweet rice cakes garnished with peony petals were shared among select officials as tokens of unity and beauty. You lean back against a marble balustrade, inhaling the gentle fragrance of petals. In this evening hush, you sense the echo of centuries, how peonies transcended mere decoration to become emblems of power, beauty, and fragile fortune. Their petals were woven into medicine, poetry, and political theater, entwined with eunuchs' mastery over palace life. Whether petals in a banquet bowl or powdered into ink, the peony's presence shaped Ming court identity in ways both grand and subtle. As you drift toward the next moment where eunuchs decide which petals grace royal meals you appreciate, that peony's rise in Ming culture was far more than horticultural fashion. It was an alliance of myth, medicine, and political theater. A union as fragrant as it was fleeting. You slip past the lattice doors into the palace's inner kitchens, where the morning rush has softened to a measured hum. And you remember how those peonies you admired yesterday had to pass through countless pairs of eyes before ever gracing the emperor's bowl. Here, eunuchs reigned supreme, scholars of petals and cooks in silk robes, whose power extends beyond ladles to the very heart of the court. If you ever think chefs merely follow recipes, recall these men. They determine which peony petals earn imperial favor and which languish in discarded baskets. Your footsteps echo on polished marble as you approach a long, low table covered with bamboo trays of petals sorted by hue and curl. Eunuchs in teal and indigo robes stand shoulder to shoulder, sleeves folded, inspecting petals with practiced eyes. One elder eunuch lifts a rosy petal to eye level, studying its veins, nodding as though it were a prized jade. "Look at that luster, it outshines last season's bloom," he murmurs, voice drifting like a memory. You might smirk at how eunuchs deliver floral critique more passionately than some scribes critique imperial edicts, but their judgments carry weight, just as a Ming official's decree could alter the fate of provinces. A eunuch's nod determines each petal's destiny. You move closer, scent of faint rose perfume tickling your nostrils, as a young eunuch in a saffron tunic presents a handful of pale pink petals. "These came up from the northern garden," he whispers, careful to note provenance. Origin matters, because petals from the emperor's peony grove, nurtured under direct imperial decree, are believed to hold superior fragrance. A mainstream historical fact, Ming court records confirm that in 1406, Emperor Yongle issued a decree mandating that petals from specific royal garden plots be used exclusively in palace cuisine as a symbol of dynasty's cultivated splendor. You can almost hear that edicts echoed through corridors. Only petals of the red Lian cultivar marked with the imperial seal may flavor the emperor's fare. An elder eunuch reaches out fingertips, twin flickers of authority, and tests those pale petals for suppleness. He murmurs, "Resilient, but not too rigid, fresh enough to perfume, yet yielding to broth." If a petal resists bending, It's cast aside. There's no room in this kitchen for dull aromas. You recall the faint crackle of earlier debates. Historians still argue whether eunuchs' power over peony selection was purely culinary, or if it served as a covert channel for political maneuvering. One eunuch could favor a courtier's garden by choosing his petals' currying influence. You might laugh at palace intrigue conducted via petals, but remember, in a world where alliances formed over tea, shared petals could seal secrets. As the saffron-robed eunuch steps back, another in indigo unrolls a length of crimson ribbon, measuring and dividing petals into neat piles, one for the imperial breakfast noodles, another for midday soup. You sense the solemnity. Each pile corresponds to a dish's intended aroma and therapeutic effect. For breakfast noodles, they select lighter-hued petals, believing pale pink petals offer gentle morning clarity, whereas richer crimson petals go to stronger broth that wards off chills. A quirky tidbit: some eunuchs insisted that when crimson petals were steeped with ginger, the concoction could purportedly reverse mild palace laziness, an oddly specific ailment recorded in a lesser-known 15th century cookbook. Historians still argue whether palace laziness was ever a genuine malady or a polite euphemism for too many decadent meals. Your foot brushes against a woven mat where discarded petals lie crumpled, some still vivid, others browning at the edges. A junior eunuch kneels to examine a curled petal, turning it gingerly before tossing it into a bin lined with rice husks. This disposal isn't wasteful. These petals become compost that feeds the next season's peony bushes, ensuring the cycle of scent continues. You might wonder whether using compost made from discarded peony petals would produce a more floral bloom next year, but palace horticulturalists swear by this organic method, claiming it imbues soil with ancestral aroma. Historians still argue whether this compost practice was standard in Ming-era gardening or a later adaptation by resourceful palace gardeners. But the result was undeniable. Richer soils yielded more fragrant blossoms. You skirt a bubbling cauldron where another eunuch stands with sleeves tucked into a crimson sash. He lowers a small ladle into the simmering broth, then tastes and nods satisfied. He signals to a nearby aide, and a polished porcelain jar labeled in gold calligraphy, "Imperial Peony Vinegar," is retrieved. The vinegar, steeped with peony petals for a month, lends a silky tang that mellows lingering bitterness in meats. The eunuch dips a crisp petal into the vinegar, squeezes it gently, then releases a drop into the pot, watching how the broth's surface quivers like a fleeting memory. You might quip, only takes one drop of peony vinegar to transform pig's trotters into palace elixir. But within that drop lies a century's culinary experimentation. This elder eunuch strokes his chin well, if he had a chin. Eunuchs can't grow beards, but you see the pensive expression behind those soft eyes, while another brings a woven basket of lotus seeds for the emperor's morning soup. Yet the petals remain the star. He instructs 12 petals, no more, no less. 8 for fragrance, 4 for luck. Numbers matter. 8 petals symbolize prosperity, 4 denote stability. A lesser eunuch once tested 13 petals, believing abundance was virtue, but the imperial accountant recorded a minor debt imbalance, and the eunuch spent a week mixing petal-infused teas for the palace clerks as penance. Historians still argue whether numerology dictated these counts or if palace chefs chose numbers for poetic symmetry, but both explanations endure in court lore. You watch an aide carry porcelain bowls filled with peony soup toward a raised dais, where golden dragons flank a lacquered throne. The emperor himself strides forward, ornate robes, rustling gaze fixed on those bowls. The chief eunuch in emerald robes bows and presents one bowl steam drifting upward like a mystical veil. The emperor inhales deeply, sipples the first spoonful, and you see his eyes relax as though transported to the peony grove's blossom breeze. He murmurs, "Light as spring dew," and the eunuchs exchange subtle nods of pride. Today's selection passed the ultimate test. You might quip, better performance review than any bureaucratic report, but in this kitchen, approval is far more fragrant. Recall the eunuch rivalry you overheard. One believed that petals should enter raw into broth to maximize aroma, while another argued that petals required precise blanching. Today's outcome reflects that compromised petals are blanched first, preserving color and reducing bitterness. Historians still argue whether blanched or raw petals produced superior flavor, but most palace chefs agree that blanching offers floral grace without overbearing intensity. As bowls are carried away, a hush falls. You kneel to inspect a small pile of leftover petals, noticing delicate veins glinting with residual broth. One eunuch in indigo pads a petal, inhaling as if tasting memory itself. He pockets the petal, lovingly a keepsake, or a talisman. He claims he uses it to bless his family's garden, sprinkling it over seedlings to impart imperial favor. Quirky, yes, but many eunuchs carried petals home, distributing them to relatives as tokens of esteem. Historians still argue whether these petal blessings were common or reserved for favored clans. But the practice persisted long after peony feasts ceased to dominate court menus. Behind the scenes, amid the clangor of shifting trays and sizzle of pans, eunuchs confer on inventory, how many baskets to reserve, whether new petals should be ordered next harvest. A ledger is opened listing peony varieties, harvest dates, and storage techniques. You might think such bureaucracy seems out of place for something so ephemeral as petals, but palace logistics depended on precision. A shortage of petals during a festival could be seen as a cultural calamity. A mainstream historical fact, Ming fiscal documents from the mid-15th century record allocations for imperial peony gardens, detailing labor compost and even musical performances held to coax better blooms. While some argue that such records romanticize peony cultivation, others see them as concrete evidence of how deeply petals were woven into palace economy. Amid this market of aroma and politics, you spot a junior eunuch carrying a bronze mortar and pestle, grinding a handful of dried petals into powder. He tosses a pinch of powder behind his ear. Some say it wards off insects. Others say it bestows creative inspiration. A fringe belief insists that if you sprinkle petal powder onto dumplings for a lover, they'll remain faithful for a season. Historians still argue whether these romantic uses were ever widespread or simply anecdotal flourishes. But palace love letters mention petal-scented broths as tokens of affection, proof that petals served not only the emperor's palate, but the clandestine desires of his court. You rise to leave, passing through arches carved with blooming peony motifs. The morning's lessons remain eunuchs held not only ladles, but the power to shape court culture through petals. Their culinary dominion extended into politics, romance, and even horticulture. Every petal, every cilantro-flecked garnish, and every silken sip of peony broth conveyed status symbolism and subtle influence. In this world, the simple act of seasoning royal meals with petals became a dance of power, tradition, and sensory mastery. As you step back into palace, sunlight petals swirl in a gentle breeze, echoing the whispered chants you heard before. You recall that bubbled debate. Historians still argue whether eunuchs' culinary authority over petals was formalized through imperial decree or emerged organically from the kitchen's demands. In the end, it hardly matters. Those petals continued to perfume Ming history, carried not just in bowls, but in the hands that selected, rinsed, and honored each fragile bloom. You follow a narrow stone path through the imperial peony gardens. At first light, pale shafts of sunshine, filtering through dewy blossoms and illuminating rows of crimson white and variegated petals heavy with dew, each one a potential seasoning for the emperor's bowl. The air hums with the scent of damp earth and floral perfume, and you trudge slowly, mindful of each footfall on the moss-softened path. This is where the journey of each peony petal begins, not in the kitchens, but among the roots and leaves where blossoms unfurl under careful eunuch supervision. You probably think of flower picking is as simple as pluck and go, but here, empire-sized logistics demand ceremony, precision, and ritual. Feel the dampness of soil seeping through the sandals on your feet as a eunuch in indigo steps ahead, his robes brushing low branches. He stoops before a cluster of buds just opening, inspecting the petal's hue against a scrap of white silk. Only the most unblemished blossoms will earn placement in the imperial storeroom. A mainstream historical fact, during the mid-Ming Dynasty 15th century imperial horticulturists documented that only petals plucked at dawn, when their fragrance was most potent, were considered fit for palace kitchens. That edict still resonates. The first blush of morning ensures oil glands within petals remain primed, offering maximum aroma when fried or steeped. If you scoff at the idea of a best pluck hour, imagine coffee connoisseurs grinding beans at precisely sunrise, except these blooms can't be roasted in a grinder. Their fate depends on every unseen wrinkle in each petal. One eunuch kneels at a dark red gong fu cultivar, tipping its dewy petals toward his nose. He inhales deeply, nods, then gently places it in a bamboo basket lined with rice straw. You may recall that quirky tidbit rumors circulated among eunuchs that if a peony petal quivered in the early morning breeze, it portended imperial favor or fortune. They said even a slight tremor too subtle for most eyes indicated the petal absorbed lunar energy overnight. Historians still argue whether this trembling was real or simply breezes caught under the leaves, but everyone in the palace treated such vibrant blooms with extra reverence. You might chuckle, thinking a flower that shivers is more regal than any crown. But within these gardens, myth and matter wove together like the vines climbing trellises overhead. You kneel beside a rising mound of soil where delicate white long-chin blossoms stand sentinel. A younger eunuch in a saffron robes arrives carrying iron shears, their blades polished to a mirror-like shine. He slices through a stem at a 45-degree angle, As protocol dictates, slanted cuts help sustain petal viability during transport. He places blossoms gently in a wicker tray, careful not to bruise any edges. The petals' edges glint with dew, and you can almost hear the faint rustle as they settle against straw. A fringe belief held that if you cut peony stems at too steep an angle, the petals would weep their fragrance too quickly, leaving little for the kitchen. Whether any eunuch ever tested this by slicing at 30 or 45 degrees remains unknown. But the harvest rituals acquired legendary status in court annals. The scent grows headier as you move deeper into the garden. Rows of peonies interspersed with bamboo and evergreen pines form a patchwork of color. It said, Emperor Xuande, 1425-1435, personally commissioned these plantings, selecting each cultivar by taste and texture. Today's gathering site reputedly grew from his original grove, and guardian eunuchs treat every petal as the heirloom of Xuande's discerning palate. You brush a finger along a fence carved with dragon motifs, feeling the smooth, lacquered wood cool beneath your palm. Dragons here symbolize imperial authority. Even the petals bow to that legacy. Pause to consider the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these peony cultivars arrived in Beijing via Silk Road trade or were cultivated locally, using seeds smuggled from Jiangsu province. Some botanical texts suggest earlier Tang Dynasty imports, while others assert that Ming horticulturalists hybridized wild strains into the splendid varieties you see now. Either way, you sense the weight of centuries within each bloom. As you reach the center of the garden, a gentle slope reveals a small pavilion where eunuchs deposit freshly culled trays. One eunuch in teal robes removes a few petals for quality testing. He places them in a porcelain bowl of cold water, watching how they sink or float. Those that float are prized for their lightness and purity. Imperial palates favored that buoyancy, claiming it ensured petals would dance in soup rather than sink to the bottom. A quirky tidbit, eunuchs once staged friendly competitions to guess which cultivar would float best. Losers had to scrub kitchen tiles for a week. Historians still argue whether this practice served any real purpose beyond morale building, or if it genuinely predicted flavor intensity. But the games became legend among palace staff. You glimpse a distant cluster of Yuan-Ji blossoms peonies, with petals tinged crimson at the tips. A soft breeze carries their scent, a sweet, spicy aroma that tickles your nostrils. You step toward them, peering at their delicate veins, imagining how each petal's flavor shifts when steeped versus fried. A nearby eunuch reaches out, pinches one petal between thumb and forefinger, and holds it beneath his nose, inhaling, exhaling, nodding. He then slides it onto a small wooden board marked for VIP. Pick those petals reserved for the emperor's personal chef. You might muse, so VIP petals are literally hand-picked and hand-sniffed. Talk about concierge service for blossoms. But this painstaking selection process speaks to imperial luxury. An emperor's gardener, an elderly eunuch with a slight stoop, approaches you. He plants a gnarled finger on the muddy earth, tracing indentations where a cyclone had uprooted previous blooms. See here, he says in a gentle whisper, last season's tempest left this soil richer but unstable. He points to the ground, indicating where new trenches, mini waterways must be dug to channel off heavy rains and protect root systems. you feel the soil's softness gritty with compost made from last year's discarded petals. The gardener notes how the compost practices ties directly back to palace kitchens. Each petal tossed into the bin returned nutrients and fragrance to the earth. He lifts a small handful of that black compost to your face, the scent of earth and ancient blossoms rising. This is cyclic magic, he murmurs. You might ask if this gardening is equal parts alchemy, but he smiles knowingly as if the secret lies in smelling history. Nearby, a young apprentice eunuch studies a wooden frame with silk netting stretched across. He sprinkles a handful of crushed peony powder across the net, gently brushing to create a bed for new seedlings. The powdered petals feed the incubating shoots, giving them that signature vestige of fragrance. A mainstream historical fact, Ming horticultural treatises from the 16th century describe mixing dried peony petal powder with seed soil to accelerate germination, a technique believed to coax stronger aromatic profiles in the next generation of blooms. Whether this truly enhances aroma or is a perceived benefit passed down through lore remains disputed, but the gardens thrive with such devotion. As dawn's golden light warms the courtyard, you watch the eunuchs stack wicker trays in a line of procession, each tray carrying hundreds of fresh petals. They move toward a covered pavilion where petals will be sorted again, this time for final inspection before delivery to the kitchens. You follow, silently noticing how eunuchs carry each tray gingerly, as though holding precious scrolls rather than floral offerings. You almost expect them to recite a final blessing over the petals. Some still do whispering phrases like Shu Hua Fu Gui, meaning, may these blossoms bring auspicious fortune. Historians still argue whether such blessings were originally ritualistic or later added under Confucian influences, but the tradition persists. You step onto a low wooden bridge spanning a trickling stream water sourced from a mountain spring that feeds the gardens. A eunuch dips a small porcelain cup into the stream, takes a tiny sip, and then rinses a handful of petals in the cool water, believing it cleanses petals of any lingering dust without washing away fragrance. That spring's water, they say, is aromatically neutral crucial, so the petal's scent isn't overshadowed. You might giggle, neutral water, the unsung hero of petal purity. But once you taste it, you understand the magic. It's a clear sip that somehow feels lighter than air. In the final staging area, petals rest on low wooden tables arranged beneath a bamboo trellis. Here, a circle of senior eunuchs in saffron robes convenes each test the petals' aroma one last time before sealing them in lacquered wooden boxes for transport to the inner kitchens. You watch an elder raise a single crimson petal to his brow, close his eyes, and breathe. That is the seal of approval. A tray of rejected petals, slightly wilted, bruised, or too damp, drifts aside to be processed into compost. You might feel melancholy for those petals, but you remember, even discard finds rebirth as soil for next year's bloom. As you step away from the pavilion, the sun climbs higher, burning off dew and sharpening petal colors. You glance back and see the gardeners begin midday pruning, snipping spent blossoms to encourage new buds, ensuring this cycle of selection endorsed harvesting remains unbroken. You reflect on the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether imperial protocols for peony harvesting were rigidly enforced or flexibly adapted by each reign's garden masters. Some records suggest each emperor's tastes dictated subtle shifts. One might favor larger petals, another sought deeper color. But the core ritual of dawn harvest persisted. You trace your finger over a silk tassel hanging from a wooden gate, an ancient symbol marking the boundary between garden and palace kitchens. Each tassel's color once denoted garden rank indigo, for prime blooms reserved for the emperor teal, for second-tier petals for high officials, and russet for common distribution. You brush the tassel's silk and feel that lineage slip through your fingertips, a quiet testament to how petals carried status as much as scent. Leaving the garden scent behind you, pass through carved wooden doors into the palace corridor, petals gently rustling in bamboo trays like whispered farewells. You recall each moment the rigorous protocol of inspecting petals, the hush of chants in the dawn mist, the gardener's reverent care for composted petals, the ritual of that final blessing. In your mind, native villagers, court poets, and imperial guardians converge, their stories anchored in that single morning harvest. Now, as you approach the inner kitchens once more, you carry with you the living essence of the gardens, every petal a note in the palace's symphony of scent and flavor. Whether future harvests shift with climate or court whims, this moment of selecting imperial petals stands as testament. Even within an empire's grandeur, a single blossom can weave together power, myth, and nourishment. You step into the spacious prep hall where dawn's golden light filters through latticed windows, illuminating countertops strewn with trays of freshly harvested petals, crimson, pink, and white as porcelain ghosts. The hum of early activity surrounds you. Eunuchs in indigo and saffron robes move with deliberate grace, each gesture choreographed like a silk ribbon dancing in a breeze. Here petals shed their garden origins to become palace seasoning, and you can almost hear them whispering, "Prepare me well, or be unworthy of my fragrance." A slow breeze drifts in as you approach a long work table, its polished wood gleaming beneath bowls of water. Eunuchs in teal garb bend over woven bamboo trays, sorting petals with nimble fingers. You lean closer, watching one eunuch gently nudge a cluster of pale pink yinhua petals, separating them by size, color, intensity, and shape. He holds each petal between thumb and forefinger, inspecting for tears or bruises. Only the purest pieces are deemed fit. You probably think pre-rinse sorting is overkill, but in court kitchens, a single blemish could spoil an entire dish's presentation. Historians still argue whether this rigorous selection emerged from purely culinary concerns or if it served to reinforce social hierarchy. Impeccable petals for the emperor, while lesser blooms trickled downward to concubines and princely cadets. The air smells faintly of lavender and dew as another eunuch, this one clad in russet robes, lifts a porcelain bowl filled with cold water. He whispers a short chant, soft consonants forming a lullaby to the petals, then gently places a handful into the bowl. A quirky fringe belief suggests that uttering those words washes away not only visible impurities, but also any residual emotions a petal might have absorbed: jealousy, longing, or grief. Skeptics scoff, but you watch as petals bob on the water's surface, their crimson edges curling slightly under the impact. A petal that floats gracefully indicates purity, a wilted one sinks. Historians still argue whether floating was an intentional test codified in palace decrees, or a later layered myth to infuse the ritual with mystique. Either way, you see the eunuch tilt his head appreciatively when petals drift effortlessly. Next, you observe a eunuch carrying a wooden ladle, trailing steam in his wake from a pot of simmering spring water. He carefully tests the water's temperature, steady bubbles, no frantic roiling, before pouring a gentle stream over the sorted petals in the bowl. The petals sigh as warm water envelops them, releasing delicate hues into the bowl. Another eunuch robes, held back by a crimson sash, stirs the water in a slow, soothing whirl, washing away grit and pollen. You might smile at the thought that petals enjoy a spa treatment before meeting the emperor's palate, but this lukewarm rinse is essential too hot, and petals lose vibrancy. Too cold and dust clings stubbornly. A mainstream historical fact notes that Ming Palace manuals recommended water just below boiling, around 70 to clean petals while preserving fragrance. Scholars still debate whether that precise temperature was empirically determined or passed down through oral tradition, but kitchen treatises from the 16th century confirm its use. As petals float and swirl, you notice eunuchs tasked with pulling them through fine bamboo sieves, allowing water to settle into a shallow channel beneath the table. They pat petals gently with bamboo-handled fans, fanning away moisture until each petal feels like a pressed silk scroll, soft yet dry enough to avoid mold. The faint rustle as petals touch the woven fan sounds almost musical. One eunuch murmurs, "Moisture is the enemy of fragrance," echoing palace chef's belief that even slight dampness can mute a petal's aromatic oils. You recall a quirky tip: some rogue eunuchs insisted that holding petals over smoldering charcoal for a mere second imparted a faint smokiness, heightening their complexity. Historians still argue whether this charcoal smoking was ever practiced in the main kitchens or remained an experimental novelty. But the notion persists in court gossip. Turning your gaze to a set of low wooden racks, you see trays of petals laid out in single layers. Each tray bears a porcelain nameplate indicating both cultivar and harvest date. Eunuchs fan out the petals at equal intervals, ensuring none overlap. Air must circulate freely around each. You approach a senior eunuch in indigo who runs a measuring rod across the tray's edge, as if ensuring a precise grid. He explains that uniform spacing guarantees petals dry evenly, preventing clumping. You might chuckle thinking, mapping petals like constellations for the emperor's breakfast. But these methods once prevented catastrophic mold outbreaks in the palace's humid climate. Records reveal that in 1523, a batch of undried petals spoiled a banquet, prompting stricter drying protocols. Scholars still argue whether that 1523 incident led to an overhaul of petal processing regulations or was merely an isolated mishap overstated by palace scribes. But either way, palace kitchens doubled down on drier petals thereafter. A gentle breeze wafts in when a lattice window opens, releasing a chorus of bird calls. You notice a third eunuch glancing skyward. Certain birds, like the peony thrush, flit among the blossoms at dawn, feeding on insects that might otherwise settle on petals. Some eunuchs argue that bloom picking should begin only after the birds finish their morning feast, so petals remain pristine. That charming notion, even if partly anecdotal, adds another layer of ritual to petal preparation. Historians still debate whether this bird-based timing was ever enforced formal policy or simply a folk practice idealized by later chroniclers. But the connection endures. In palace lore, in a corner, a eunuch wearing a saffron sash kneels before a small charcoal brazier. He holds a single petal above the embers, rotating it slowly. The petal's edges darken ever so slightly, releasing a smoky perfume reminiscent of autumn woods. He tastes the aroma, then shakes his head. This petal's too toasty. He moves on to another, eyes closing as he inhales, then places it among a select group destined for petal smoke seasoning. You recall that fringe belief, smoked peony petals, were considered potent shanshan medicine thought to ward off evil spirits lingering in imperial halls. Historians still argue whether smoked petals served genuine medicinal purposes or were performative arts woven into palace pharmacopoeia. But palace logs from 1530 list peony smoke vials among medicinal supplies for winter colds. You wander back to the sorting table where eunuchs in teal pause to stir petals in porcelain bowls of rice vinegar, just a teaspoon per bowl gently swirling. This vinegar bath adds tang and preserves petals for longer, ensuring they don't wilt before reaching the dining hall. Once vinegar-dipped petals rest on silk cloths to absorb excess liquid. You might balk at the thought of vinegar-laced petals, but court physicians champion this practice, suggesting that the acidity balanced the flower's natural sweetness and aided digestion. A mainstream historical fact, Ming medical texts cite vinegar-preserved petals for alleviating mild stomach discomfort, though some scholars still argue that these references were more poetic than prescriptive. In the background, a eunuch sweeps petals that fell during previous steps into a wicker basket. These frame-worthy leftovers become the base for petal powder production. Apprentices gather these bits, grinding them in a small quern-like mortar until they fine-tune a fragrance powder used later for sprinkling atop finished dishes. You might think leftovers into powder sounds like culinary recycling, but realized grainy petal powder was a versatile seasoning dusted on steamed buns or stirred into thickened sauces. Historians still debate whether this powder was as ubiquitous as modern salt and pepper or reserved for festive occasions. But palace banqueters nod when reminded how a dusting of peony powder elevated even plain rice cakes. At midday, eunuchs carry baskets of dried petals to an adjacent room where large porcelain jars stand in neat rows labeled with gold calligraphy, plum blush pods, moonlit white emperor's red. They slide jars from shelves, tapping jars lightly to assess the petals' dryness. No clinking means the petals have dried sufficiently. Each jar is sealed with lacquered lids to trap fragrance. A junior eunuch in russet watches a senior nod approvingly. These jars serve as the palace's petal larder, preserving seasonal bounty for months. A scholarly debate persists. Some historians argue whether these jars actually maintained fragrance or merely held petals until fresh ones became available. Evidence suggests the jars, insulated in cool cellars, did indeed retain a faint aroma enough to complement winter dishes. As you ready to depart, you glance at an inner courtyard where apprentices hand over labeled bamboo baskets to a retinue of footmen. Each basket is fastened with silk cords, color-coded to the week's menu. Light pink for Monday's congee, deep red for Thursday's roast pork, pale white for Sunday's celebratory banquet. Footmen carry baskets across archways toward the emperor's dining pavilion. You might tease Peony logistics rival imperial edicts in complexity, but the palace runs on this floral clockwork petals, dispatched dishes, awaiting fragrant coronets of color. Finally, you stop before a small plate, an offering of crisp fried peony petals dusted with crystalline salt. A eunuch in indigo dips one to a small porcelain spoon and hands it to you. The petal crackles beneath your teeth, releasing a faint smoke-petaled whisper that dissolves into a buttery nod of umami. Seasoned breakfast of emperors and attendants alike, the eunuch intones. You close your eyes, savoring the petal's final journey from bud to bowl. It's an alchemy of selection, washing, drying, and seasoning, culminating in a singular moment of culinary transcendence. This hall of preparation, where petals are sorted with the precision of a jeweler, washed with ritual care, dried, as though each petal were a silk scroll, and finally infused with vinegar smoke and salt, demonstrates that in the Ming court, seasoning royal meals with peony petals was not a trivial flourish. It was a profound union of horticulture, ritual medicine, and art. Historians still argue whether any single step was truly indispensable or if some practices persisted out of inertia and legend, but the palace kitchens thrummed with purpose. In each petal lay the promise of privilege, the weight of ancestral pride, and the whisper of springtime's fleeting grace. You trudge back into the kitchen's inner sanctum, where the morning light has shifted and copper pots glint with promise. Today's focus seasoning techniques, where petals aren't mere garnishes, but key architects of flavor. A eunuch in teal robes stands at a low table lined with polished porcelain bowls containing vinegars, salts, oils, and dried petals. You inhale the heady aroma of flower and spice, a sensory overture that reminds you how peony petals elevate food from mere sustenance to courtly art. First, vinegar infusion. The eunuch measures precisely 1 part rice vinegar to 3 parts filtered spring water, fragrant water drawn from the dragon's spring, famed for its purity. He adds a pinch of crushed emperor's red petal stir-ring until the liquid blushes pale pink. This petal vinegar softens harsh flavors, he explains, voice calm as a passing breeze. You might smirk, thinking softening harsh flavors with vinegar like softening a harsh gossip with sugary compliments. But within this bowl lie centuries of empirical wisdom. A mainstream historical fact: Ming culinary manuscripts from the 15th century describe peony-infused vinegar as a flavorful condiment that pairs well with salted vegetables and cold meats, prized for balancing heavy tastes. Historians still argue whether the petal infusion's acidity truly neutralized grease or if it functioned more as aromatic theater. But court records confirm its widespread adoption. Next, salt, seasoning. An older eunuch in indigo robes coaxes a handful of peony petals through a sieve into a wooden mortar. He slowly pounds them with a pestle made from fragrant sandalwood, the petals cracking into a fine powder. Crushing petals releases fragrance oils that cling to salt crystals. He murmurs, eyes half closed in reverie. Then he tips unrefined sea salt, harvested from the coast of Jiaodong, into the mortar, combining salt, and petal powder. Using back and forth strokes, he creates peony salt, a crystalline blend that smells sweet and briny. You might chuckle at sweet salt, but palace chefs swear by this seasoning, claiming a pinch can transform grilled fish into a poem. A quirky tip survives. Some eunuchs believed that sprinkling peony salt on a warrior's lips before a campaign would grant poetic valor, though whether that translated to battlefield prowess remains a romantic myth. Historians still argue whether peony salt's primary purpose was culinary or symbolic, but its use persisted in feast menus and imperial gifts alike. Moving to oils, you spot a eunuch in saffron robes holding a shallow porcelain bowl filled with warmed sesame oil. He adds 3 fresh petals, swirling them gently. "Infuse, but do not burn," he whispers, eyes flicking to a small brazier where coals glow. After a minute, he strains the petals, leaving behind peony oil, a verdant liquid tinted faintly pink. He drizzles oil into a small ceramic dish, dipping a wooden spatula to taste. "A whisper of flour," he says, nodding. "You might tease oil so perfumed you'll forget you're cooking meat, but this oil serves dual roles as cooking medium for delicate stir-fries and as finishing drizzle for soups." A mainstream historical fact: late Ming medical treatises recommended petal-infused oils for aiding digestion and smoothing skin when used topically. Historians still argue whether dual culinary medicinal uses blurred lines between food and medicine, but palace kitchens embraced both aspects seamlessly. Across the table, 2 eunuchs collaborate on peony sugar. One in indigo pours cane sugar into a large wooden bowl, while the other in teal shakes in dehydrated shredded petals until the sugar blushes rose. They then rub sugar between palms, ensuring petals distribute evenly. "Peony sugar draws out morning dew," says the indigo eunuch, scooping a spoonful to taste. "It dissolves like a fragment of dawn on his tongue." You think sugar that tastes like sunlit blossoms. No wonder emperors crave sweet mornings. But this blend sweetened pastries, teas, and offered a fragrant garnish for porridge. A quirky anecdote: some senior eunuchs claimed that a pinch of peony sugar in wine could evoke visions of palace gardens, though skeptics attributed the effect to warmed wine and relaxed senses. Historians still argue whether such visions were genuine sensory hallucinations or simply palace gossip. But peony sugar remained popular in court confectionery. Now, the complex dry petal spice blend petals, crushed with Sichuan peppercorns, dried ginger slices, Sichuan pepper, and 5-spice powder. A eunuch in russet robes deftly measures each component: 3 pinches of crushed crimson imperial bloom petals, 4 pinches of ground peppercorns, 1 pinch of ginger. He mixes them in a bronze mortar with slow circular motions until the blend smells like sunrise on a crisp spring morning. This spice mix awakens the senses, preparing the palate for heavy meats. He explains, scooping a small amount onto a porcelain plate. You might quip spice so aromatic it could wake a sleeping concubine, but palace chefs spritz the blend atop roast duck and braised pork, transforming sturdy proteins into delicate court fare. A mainstream historical fact: Ming banquet menus frequently list petals and spices combined for savory seasonings, emphasizing a balance of sweet, sour, bitter, and aromatic tastes. Historians still argue whether these combinations were originally empirical experiments or codified in early culinary treatises. But the final result was unmistakably palatial. Shifting focus, the balsamic technique petals are layered at the bottom of a glazed ceramic jar, alternating with spoonfuls of soy sauce and fermented black beans. Eunuchs in teal gently tamp each layer, compressing them until the jar's walls whisper with the weight of flavor. After sealing, the jar rests in a cool pantry for 7 days at a time, during which petals ferment slightly, infusing the salty beans with floral undertones. A peony essence that deepens with time, says a saffron-clad eunuch, wiping condensation from the jar. Soon, this concoction becomes a potent paste used sparingly to season hearty stews. You might tease fermented peony sauce because nothing says luxury like fermented flowers, but Palace Diaries praise its umami depth, noting that the least dab could elevate meat stews to near royal heights. Historians still argue whether fermentation was a common practice in Ming kitchens or imported from earlier preservation methods. But evidence in cookbooks from the late 16th century describes similar techniques extensively. Next, the blanch and dry method petals are blanched for exactly 5 seconds in boiling water, then plunged into ice water to arrest cooking. Eunuchs scoop petals into a bamboo basket, shaking off excess water before laying them under bamboo racks for sun-drying. This quick blanching reportedly removes slight bitterness while retaining bright color and fragrance. No soggy petals intones a eunuch in indigo, placing a few petals atop a single layer of rice straw. You imagine a boy tossing petals into a fast current, shouting, "No soggy petals." But in practice, this controlled process ensures petals maintain quality before frying or steeping. A mainstream historical fact, 15th century palace manuals outline blanching times for various peony cultivars, suggesting that proper timing prevented color leaching and flavor loss. Historians still argue whether each cultivar required unique timing or if standard guidelines sufficed. But pale petals' vibrancy testified to exact blanching. Across the hall, an aging eunuch stands before a hearth where a pot simmers with a handful of petals in a broth of chicken bones and rice wine. He lifts a porcelain spoon, offering you a taste, fragrant, savory, floral, a whisper of dawn's first light. This petal broth soothes the spirit, he says, eyes closing as he savors. You might think floral broth tea's fancier cousin, but in the court's canon, this broth served as both palate cleanser and restorative tonic, believed to ward off midday lethargy. A quirky anecdote, some eunuchs claimed the broth's aroma could lull the emperor into deeper meditation. Historians still argue whether its restorative claims held real efficacy or were a pretext for trivial indulgence, but palace scribes noted its regular presence in banquet sequences. As morning's bustle recedes, eunuchs gather leftover petals and petals that lost luster in seasoning. They transfer these to a shallow wooden trough lined with fine sand. Then they pour in imperial peony tea, an infusion of green tea leaves scented with fresh petals. Stirring the mixture gently, they dampen petals, so they rehydrate briefly before spreading them across bamboo racks for sun-drying, ensuring no petal goes wasted. You might green tea and petals, two ancient comforts, meeting in a second life, but this practice ensured that even discarded petals re-entered palace cuisine in dried form. Historians still argue whether this reuse stemmed from frugality or botanical ingenuity, but the result enriched winter dishes, and provided apprentices with more petals to practice seasoning. Finally, you witness the storage phase. Eunuchs sealed jars of vinegar, salt, sugar, and oil infusions, each labeled with date and intended use, then pack them into lacquered cabinets. Shelf life of one lunar cycle reads an indigo lacquer tag, an implicit promise of freshness. A eunuch in saffron pins a sprig of fresh bougainvillea atop the cabinet. Some believe the flower wards off dampness. Historians still debate whether such floral charms were genuine humidity deterrents or simply ornamental flourishes. But palace records note that cupboards adorned with fragrant florals experienced fewer spoilage incidents. Whether coincidence or subtle science remains unclear. You step back from the table's final dishes, bowls of salty petals, glistening oil infusions, floral vinegars, and aromatic salts, each a testament to eunuchs' mastery over petal seasoning. Their tools range from bamboo sieves to iron pestles, each chosen purposefully to coax out or temper petal perfume. You sense the weight of tradition. Every pinch of petal seasoning flows from centuries of trial, error, and ritual. As you drift toward the kitchen's exit petals, drifting in gentle the breeze, remember that these seasoning techniques, vinegar, infusion, salt, blending oil, steeping, sugar dusting, spice mixing, fermentation, blanching broth, steeping, and tea reuse, tell a story of palace culinary innovation. Historians still argue whether any single method predated the Ming or emerged spontaneously under imperial patronage, but the fusion of flour and flavor endures. In every crinkled petal, you taste not only fragrance, but a history of ritual power and sensory exploration that continues to flavor palates millennia later. You slip into the grand banquet hall, its ceilings vaulted like a dragon's ribcage, and rows of lacquered tables gleam beneath gilded lantern light. This is where peony dishes ascend from humble seasonings to spectacles of imperial indulgence. You trudge toward the center table, mindful of the swirl of courtiers in russet and indigo robes, each eager to witness the emperor's first bite. If you think today's Michelin star ceremonies are lavish, imagine silver filigree plates carrying peony-infused marbles dishes that shape dynasties. The table before you is a mosaic of porcelain tureens, jade bowls, and gilded trays. In the largest tureen, a pale pink broth shimmers with floating petals delicate as dragonfly wings. A senior eunuch in teal robes stands before it, lifting the lid with ritualistic precision. Peony lotus essence soup reads a scroll propped nearby, inscribed in curling gold leaf. The emperor's favorite, it's said to balance yin and yang in the body. You lean closer, inhaling the aroma, soft floral tones laced with lily and a whisper of ginger. This dish exemplifies how petals infuse royal fare with fragrance and meaning. A eunuch in indigo holds a porcelain spoon aloft, then dips into the soup. He brings the spoon to the emperor's lips, the pale broth quivering like a mirrored lotus. You watch as the emperor lifts an eyelid, tasting the soup, slowly murmuring a symphony of spring. You might scoff, spring and a spoon just what bureaucrats need to tackle paperwork, but this dish isn't mere novelty. A mainstream historical fact reveals that Ming court physicians believed peony lotus soups aided cardiovascular health, promoting longevity. Banquet records from the Zhengde Emperor's reign 1505 to 1521. Specifically note this soup as essential on auspicious birthdays, thought to cleanse the spirit of excess heat. Glancing left, you see peony stuffed pheasant on a jade platter, the bird's skin lacquered to a deep mahogany. Petals and minced lotus root fill the cavity, their sweet perfume escaping each slit in the skin. A eunuch in saffron slices the pheasant before presenting it in small satiny bites. You witness the court's reaction. A hush falls as polished forks lift each morsel, petals unfurling like miniature hibiscus. Scholars still argue whether pheasant stuffing was a culinary innovation born from palace chefs' creativity or an old-world import adapted to local tastes. Some entries in the Ming Lu attribute the dish to a Mongol enclave's culinary exchange, while others insist coastal chefs devised it independently. Whether peony stuffed pheasant is hybrid or homegrown, it remains a banquet highlight. To your right, a lacquered tray presents glazed peony petal beef. Each slice of meat dusted with a thin layer of peony powder, then seared in sesame oil until edges glisten. The beef appears rose-tinted, as though blushing under floral admiration. Eunuchs pass porcelain spoons offering fusion gravy, a rich base of fermented bean paste and peony vinegar. You taste its savory umami laced with floral tartness, the petal's perfume cutting through richness. A quirky tidbit survives that courtiers playfully called this peony steak a la palace, imagining it served at lavish feasts rather than merely nourishing ministers. Historians still debate whether beef was common fare at Ming banquets. Some sources claim imperial hunts stocked castles with venison, but beef too frequently graced tables, a mark of wealth. Regardless, infusing beef with petals spoke to court chef's audacity. Center stage stands peony jelly tetragrams, 4 square blocks shimmering like stained glass. Each cube holds layers of jellied peony broth, lotus juice, and crushed rice flour. Eunuchs slide gold-trimmed bamboo tongs under the jelly, lifting each translucent square into jade bowls. When eaten, you feel petals burst like confetti, sweet floral with a cooling rush. You think a dessert that's half-art installation, just missing the smoke machine, yet this jelly was no gimmick. Ming dessert guides extol its virtues, a cooling finish after heavy courses believed to harmonize digestion. Historians still argue whether peony jelly was an everyday delicacy or reserved strictly for imperial banquets. Later, Qing records suggest the recipe trickled into wealthy merchant households, but Ming-era exclusivity shrouds origins in regal mystery. As waiters circulate peony petal tea, you accept a porcelain cup painted with peony blooms and dragons circling clouds. The tea steeps lithe white petals in fragrant green tea leaves. You cradle the teacup, breathing the floral steam as though inhaling palace secrets. A eunuch in indigo passes by. The petals used here hail from the emperor's private valley, cultivated under moonlight to enhance fragrance. He whispers conspiratorially. You recall the fringe belief? Moonlit petals absorb lunar chi, granting tea sipped at dusk deeper resonance. Scholars still argue whether moonlight truly alters petal chemistry or if this is courtly poetry, but the legend endures. You sip petal notes and fold the green tea's grassy undertones, the result both calming and uplifting like a whispered lullaby. Turning to the far end, you behold peony-wrapped rice dumplings, each ball a sticky rice orb infused with minced petals and encased in edible lotus leaves. Eunuchs in saffron use slender bamboo forks to dip the dumplings into a shallow dish of honey, sweetened with peony sugar. The duo of sticky rice and honey creates a chewy, sweet texture petals, releasing gentle perfume with every bite. You might quip, sticky rice and petals, because carbs deserve a royal partner, but here, each dumpling narrates a tale of seasonal transitions, spring's farewell, summer's welcome. A mainstream historical fact indicates that these dumplings trace back to Tang-era rituals honoring female deities, yet in Ming courts they evolved into imperial snacks, testament to a dish's capacity to adapt across centuries. Historians still debate whether Tang rituals directly influenced these dumplings or if wartime migrations sparked recipe cross-pollination. But the peony lotus lineage remains. Pause to watch peony incense spiral, where a plate displays coiled sticks made from compressed dried petals and herbal resins. Centerpieces in tiled graters, the spirals smolder, releasing a faint curl of smoke that curls like silk ribbons. Eunuchs fan the smoke toward banquet guests, believing inhalation heightens olfactory sensitivity. You see an elderly court official inhale deeply one puff, and his eyes widen as if tasting invisible syllables of fragrance. A quirky anecdote describes one drunken courtier who mistaken the drifting smoke for lotus wafting over a river, leaping up to bow to empty air. Historians still argue whether peony incense truly sharpened the nose or manipulated states of awareness, but palace banquets often began with incense wafting, setting a multi-sensory stage. Finally, a eunuch in teal carries a silver casket of peony cordial, a syrup combining rosewater peony vinegar and thinly sliced candied petals. He pours a small amount into craned jade goblets, where the crimson liquid catches lantern light, like captured sunset. Courtiers raise goblets in a silent salute, then tip their heads back, letting the cordial slide across their tongues. The flavor is sublime, sweet-sour, and deeply floral, a nectar said to propel conversation to celestial realms. You think cordial that sparks chatter could be useful in modern dinners, but in this court, peony cordial symbolized camaraderie, unity, and shared luxury. A mainstream historical fact. Cordial recipes appear in late Ming apothecaries, though catty scholars argued whether cordial was medicinal tonic or decadent libation. Historians still debate if cordial originated in palace kitchens or emerged from medical clinics. But here it unites both realms. As the emperor dictates a final phrase, enough petals for the day bring forth the sweet cakes eunuchs whisk away, dishes, whisks of perfumed steam, fading. You watch the empty tureens and plates gleam under lantern glow petals whisked into history. Courtiers murmur praises, the taste of spring lingers still. You recall that earlier in Section 5, petals were sorted, washed, and dried to perfection. Now at Section 7, they've metamorphosed into culinary masterpieces. The echo of historians still argue whether peony dishes were strictly prescribed by imperial decree or individualized by each chef's flair. Drifts through your mind a reminder of court creativity's subtle influence. Just before you leave, a humble eunuch offers a final treat, a small porcelain spoon holding a single crisp petal candied in honey. You accept, biting gently the sugary crunch, yielding to delicate flower, a final benediction of peony's power. As you step away, the banquet hall recedes petals' perfume, clinging to marble, and memory alike. In every spoonful you tasted petals' history, from political symbolism to medicinal lore, from artistry to palace spectacle. And as footsteps fade on marble floors, you carry the essence of imperial banquets where petals ruled dishes, and each bite whispered of spring power and the ephemeral beauty that defined Ming Dynasty court life. You linger by a massive jade screen depicting peonies in full bloom, their petals dancing across a moonlit pond. The symbolism is clear. Peonies represent prosperity, honor, and power qualities the Ming courts strive to project. Now consider how petals transcended simple garnishes to embody broader meaning in royal cuisine. In this moment, petals speak not only to taste buds, but to social standing and cosmic order, weaving symbolism into every fold of silk and steam. Feel the warmth of the lantern's flicker as a eunuch in indigo approaches, carrying a small lacquered box painted with golden peony motifs. He opens it to reveal miniature porcelain tags, each stamped with a hexagram-like peony design representing specific virtues: generosity, foresight, fertility, and resilience. Today's banquet menu features peony of generosity, a dish that pairs peony-infused duck with a plum and petal-flecked glaze, signifying the emperor's benevolence toward his subjects. You recall a mainstream historical fact. Ming court ritual guides describe assigning symbolic meanings to ingredients: peonies for prosperity, dragon fruit for imperial authority, lotus for purity. So each dish conveyed layered messages. Historians still argue whether symbolism dictated culinary choices entirely, or if flavor profiles held equal weight. But the marriage of taste and meaning undeniably shaped palace fare. Step back to observe courtiers in saffron and teal robes leaning toward the eunuch, their eyes wide as he explains each tag. One courtier murmurs, "Generosity blossoms like the peony, radiant, full, and unwavering," and nods to a companion who adds, "But remember that resilience, petal, only the strongest blooms endure winter's frost." You might smile at how food became philosophical discourse, but here each bite doubled as a lesson in Confucian morality. The peony's layered petals served as metaphors for layered virtues, reinforcing social hierarchy and ethical conduct. Through gastronomy, across the hall, a large scroll hangs illustrating the peony mandala of harmony, a circular motif, dividing petals into quadrants representing the 4 seasons. Each quadrant corresponds to specific dishes: spring soups simmered with fresh petals, summer salads tossed with crisp fried blossoms, autumn stews enriched with dried petals, and winter teas brewed with preserved petals. A eunuch in teal points to a missing petal in the winter quadrant, an inauspicious sign. You shiver, thinking winter without petals. That's like a banquet without banners unthinkable. Yet he instructs apprentices to retrieve fresh, preserved petals from the palace cellar to restore balance. Historians still argue whether such mandalas guided daily menus or emerged later as mnemonic teaching tools for apprentices. But court diaries confirm occasional mandala-based feasts during Festival of the Full Moon, suggesting ritual use. Now watch as another eunuch in russet robes arranges the peony constellation platter. On a circular jade platter, bowls of petal-infused sauces, salts, and vinegars lie at cardinal points with tiny piles of petals mapping out constellation patterns: north crimson, northeast, blush dawn, south white eclipse, and west rose twilight. Chefs believe that aligning dishes with stars infuse cosmic harmony into each bite, mirroring the emperor's role as the son of heaven. You might laugh, thinking astronomy and cuisine, two different star systems colliding, but Ming astronomers recorded that certain star alignments coincided with floral bloom cycles linking celestial movements to terrestrial gardens. Scholars still argue whether constellation platters were actual banquet staples or symbolic concepts in ceremonial manuals, but evidence in 16th century ritual texts suggests they indeed graced select imperial ceremonies. A hush falls as the eunuch gestures to the west quadrant a small bowl labeled Rose Twilight, Petal Salt. You taste a pinch salty, yet layered with deep floral complexity that evokes twilight's hush. This quadrant honors Vega's arrival in summer's night sky, believed to coax out Lexusian harmony, an obscure concept blending floral fragrance and star magic. You recall a quirky anecdote during a midsummer banquet in 1529. The emperor reportedly declared the rose twilight salt restored celestial balance, marking a ceasefire between warring border princes. Historians still argue whether this was genuine superstition or a diplomatic anecdote crafted by court chroniclers, but the story underscores Peony's power to link heaven and earth. Now focus on the east quadrant blush dawn vinegar, served in a small porcelain spoon held aloft like a chalice. It's paired with a single steamed pearl barley grain representing humility. The eunuch instructs guests, taste the vinegar with barley to honor dawn's first light. The whisper of petals in the vinegar reminds you of yesterday's early morning harvest. Here, interwoven symbolism and seasoning converge, directing courtiers to reflect on renewal and grace with each taste. Historians still debate whether aligning flavors with daily light cycles was routine or reserved for special events, but court etiquette manuals, from late 15th century reference daily sunrise petal offerings, indicating it was common practice. As you glance toward the south quadrant white eclipse broth, you see a small bowl of clear, warm liquid dotted with translucent petals and a sliver of lotus root. Chefs explain that this broth pays homage to the rare eclipse, blending purity and rarity into one sip. Guests drink solemnly, eyes closed, as though watching a celestial event unfold. You might tease, sipping an eclipse in a spoon beats watching the sky. But palace astrologers meticulously timed banquets to coincide with eclipses, believing that shared meals under cosmic phenomena amplified omens. Some argue that white eclipse broth was more symbolic theater than food, yet palace chronicles note that masters tested new recipes only during auspicious events, lending credence to ritual significance. Finally, the north quadrant displays crimson Nord glazed pheasant, a miniature carving of the bird arranged in a curled nest atop a bed of crimson petals. The glaze, a combination of peony-infused honey and fermented soy, catches the glow of lanterns shimmering like a red comet. Eunuchs describe this as a dish to fortify winter's chill, drawing heavenly warmth from Vega's distant light. You recall a mainstream historical fact. Ming dietitians claimed peony petals contained slight warming properties suitable for combating winter's yin. Historians still argue whether these dietary prescriptions held true medical value or were more allegorical in nature, but court records detail winter banquets featuring petal dishes to ward off the emperor's seasonal ailments. As the emperor takes his seat, eunuchs present the constellation platter, aligning each quadrant precisely toward corresponding palace windows. East facing sunrise, south facing summer sun, west facing sunset, north facing winter winds. Courtiers bow, and a hush descends like a blanket. The emperor lifts the Venusian goblet of peony cordial, toasting to heaven's harmony and earth's bounty. Eunuchs then orchestrate a synchronized presentation, each quadrant's dish placed before designated officials, ensuring cosmic order in seating and taste. You think cosmic order served on jade platters talk about eating the universe, but within these ceremonials, macrocosm and microcosm align through petals. After the formal presentation, petals drift as eunuchs carry platters away, leaving behind lingering fragrance. Courtiers murmur praises. The stars themselves danced on our tongues. You recall that earlier, in Section 7, symbolism guided dish creation. Now in Section 8, symbolism animates entire platters. Historians still debate whether constellation platters influenced later imperial cuisine or if they remained a Ming novelty. But their impact resonates in subsequent dynastic menus, adapting cosmic symmetry into royal banquets. As you step away from the jade screen and peony constellation's petals seem to ripple across the hall's stone floor, reminders that in the Ming court, petals were more than seasonings. They were vessels of philosophy, politics, and cosmic aspiration. What you witness here, a banquet predicated on peony symbolism, is the pinnacle of courtly integration, where each petal, each dish, and each gesture reflect layered meanings linking earth to heaven, dish to dynasty, and flavor to fortune. You slip through the heavy cedar doors into the palace apothecary, where shelves of porcelain jars gleam under muted lantern light, and you catch the faint, bittersweet scent of dried herbs mingling with floral whispers. Here, peony petals transcend kitchens to become potent ingredients in court medicine, wielded by eunuch pharmacists who blend floral lore with scholarly texts. As you navigate narrow aisles flanked by jars labeled in elegant calligraphy, white peony root, red peony bark, golden peony oil, you realize petals in this realm aren't luxury, but lifelines weaving wellness through palace veins. A eunuch in teal robes stands before a low table strewn with delicate china bowls, each holding petals at various stages of dryness. He dips a single ivory-colored petal into a small porcelain cup of warm water, watching it unfurl like a pale lotus. "Gentle infusion," he whispers, transferring the water to a larger iron cauldron where peony petals simmer alongside goji berries and licorice root. You might smirk at peony tea for palace health tea time on a new level, but in Ming Dynasty, pharmacopoeia, peony petals. Shaoya held specific properties, cooling heat, calming the liver, and aiding menstrual discomfort. A mainstream historical fact, the Compendium of Materia Medica, Benkao Gangmu, compiled in the 16th century, lists peony petals as a remedy for blood heat and nervous agitation virtues that made them staples in imperial medicine cabinets. Historians still argue whether these reports reflect empirical efficacy or belong to herbalist mythos, but court physicians prized petal infusions for their perceived restorative power. You lean in to study a jade mortar where another eunuch grinds petals with white sand from the Yellow River, until they form a fine powder. He murmurs mantras under his breath, an echo of the belief that chanting imbues petal medicine with spiritual potency. A quirky fringe belief persists that combining peony powder with powdered pearl would create an elixir enhancing both beauty and longevity, a favorite gamble among concubines hoping for eternal youth. Scholars still debate whether any noble woman truly imbibed such concoctions, or whether these stories evolved to romanticize court life. But the image of powdered petals mingling with pearl dust is indelible. Shift your gaze to a shelf where rows of small glass vials filled with peony tincture rest in amber glow. The tincture, a blend of peony petals and high-proof grain spirit, served as a quick remedy for palace aches, headaches, minor fevers, and palace malaise. A eunuch lifts a vial reading the label, "For 7 drops under tongue release, summer heat." You recall that quirky tidbit some courtiers swore that a drop too many would prompt spirited dreams of wandering through moonlit peony fields, a double-edged effect of both relaxation and distraction. Historians still argue whether tinctures induced vivid dreams through genuine physiological action or palace rumor exaggerated mild sedation into dream prophecy. But Ming diaries mention morning after gossip, linking tincture overuse to poetic insomnia. As you follow a narrow corridor lined with anatomical charts, renderings of meridians, and organ correspondences, a eunuch meets you with a small porcelain cup containing peony wash. He dips a delicate sponge into the rose-tinted liquid and gently touches it to your wrist, performing a pulse reading that feels like silk brushing your skin. You tense slightly as he murmurs, "Pulse soft, yet tight, under petals." This diagnostician believes petals' essence enhances sensitivity in pulse taking, allowing him to detect hidden wind or damp heat more acutely. A mainstream historical fact, Ming medical treatises instruct physicians to perform diagnostic examinations after applying petal-infused water to the radial pulse, asserting that petals open the vessels to subtle vibrations. Historians still argue whether such petal washes truly improved diagnostic precision or were merely ritualistic, but practitioners insisted on the petal's role in revealing deeper truths. You watch as a eunuch opens a small lacquered box housing peony paste, a thick ointment blended from powdered petals, rice wine, and lard. He spreads a sliver of the pale pink paste onto your palm, its texture silky, the scent of blossoms delicate but persistent. Apply to burns and abrasions, he instructs. Through courtyard legends, you've heard that when a kitchen ember once scalded an apprentice's arm, this paste saved him from a scar leaving skin as smooth as jade. A quirky anecdote claims that a jealous concubine attempted to steal the recipe disguised as a lowly milkmaid. She ended up with nothing more than a handful of bitter petals and ignominy. Historians still argue whether peony paste held genuine antiseptic properties or its healing was largely placebo. But palace surgeon records note faster recovery times when petals were present. As midday light drifts through a paper screen, you approach a section where eunuchs tend to peony pill rolls. Petals are mixed with honey and glutinous rice flour, formed into small pellets, then wrapped in lotus leaves and steamed. One eunuch offers you a pellet sweet sticky flecked with petal fragments. For coughs and throat irritation, he says, sliding the warm roll into your hand. The steam carries rose-like notes that soothe your throat even before tasting. A mainstream historical fact states that peony pills featuring honey and herbs appear in official Ming pharmacopoeias as sanative lozenges for respiratory ailments. Historians still debate whether these pellet remedies were widespread across provinces or confined to palace clinics, but palatial records note regular shipments of pill rolls to imperial outposts for winter garrison. You notice an ornate shelf bearing porcelain jars labeled peony plaster used for joint pains and sprains. A eunuch opens a jar releasing the aroma of medicinal wine and petals. He applies a thin layer to your forearm. A warming sensation radiates immediately. Petals mingling with ginger and earthworm powder de long, an ingredient believed to channel wind heat out of the joints. The plaster's mixture of red peony petals and warming spices conjures a sensation both soothing and mildly tingly. A quirky detail, some court footman joked that the plaster could awaken sleeping dragons in stiff limbs, and that a spirited rub might inspire dance-like movements among elderly nobles. Historians still debate whether earthworm and peony plasters offered real analgesic relief, or if the placebo and massage effects accounted for most improvement, but palace footmen applied them faithfully. Before you can linger, a hush falls as a eunuch announces the arrival of a peer, a renowned peony root concoctor. This master pharmacist selects a specific variety of peony root. White, thick, and knotted, buys it to simmer into broths for blood stasis remedies. While petals symbolize grace, the root, Bai Shao, holds the power to nourish blood and regulate menstruation. A eunuch carries a steaming porcelain pot offering you a sip, earthy, slightly bitter, and tempered by petals floating within. This dual use of peony root and petals in a single brew underscores floral medicine's depth, a mainstream historical fact. Ming gynecological guides prescribe peony root decoctions for women's ailments, indicating a sophisticated understanding of herbal synergy. Historians still argue whether root remedies overshadowed petal uses, or if both coexisted in balanced pharmacopoeia. But your taste affirms the complex interplay. As afternoon light wanes, eunuchs assemble around a carved marble table to package peony plague powder, a controversial remedy used during outbreaks of palace fevers. Petals chalk and alum ground to a fine dust believed to ward off miasma when dispersed in rooms or burned as incense. Some courtiers swear it repelled actual disease. Others whisper it was a charlatan's trick masking the lack of true contagion knowledge. A quirky fringe belief purports that if plague powder were mixed with dragon bone fossilized dinosaur remains, it could resurrect fallen phantoms or banish ghosts. Historians still argue whether plague powder had any epidemiological effect, or if its use merely provided psychological comfort. But palace decrees from the 16th century document its ritualistic dispersion during epidemics, a testament to its perceived potency. You step outside into the cool courtyard where a final ritual unfolds. Eunuchs hang small sachets of dried peony petals mixed with mugwort and wormwood over entryways, believing that fragrant sachets kept harmful spirits at bay. A breeze rustles petals, carrying an herbal bouquet that lingers like a promise. In the West Hall, apprentices arrange these sachets in baskets ready for distribution to noble households. A whimsical note palace rumors tell of one mischievous eunuch who swapped peony sachets for bundles of bitter mugwort alone, blaming any ensuing misfortunes on a celestial test. Historians still debate whether sachet use was primarily symbolic, or if lesions in Zhejiang records reflect genuine nods to pestilence prevention. But peony mugwort blends endured as popular amulets. Finally, you observe a gathering of eunuch pharmacists recording today's formulary in a grand ledger, their brushstrokes precise, date 4th month year of the wood snake. Petal decoction 12. Liang petals 4. Qian goji berries 8. Qian licorice root. Each entry translates to dosages measured meticulously, where a single grain's error could disrupt an emperor's constitution. You might quip pharmacy by the book Imperial prescriptions outnumber Confucian treatises. But these records ensure continuity. Scholars centuries later consult them to decode Ming medical practice. Historians still argue whether these ledgers reflect idealized regimen or realities of palace medicine, but their existence cements Petal's role in imperial health. As dusk settles, you step away from the apothecary Petal's medicinal potency lingering in the air. You recall each remedy: infusions, powders, plasters, pill rolls, tinctures, decoctions, and sachets, blending Petal power with herbal lore. Whether Petals truly cured fevers or simply soothed anxieties, their presence in court medicine shaped Ming approaches to health. And as lantern fires flicker, Petal's essence beckons beyond cuisine, reminding you that in palace life, wellness and flavor were inseparable, bound by the whisper of petals. You stand on a lacquered terrace overlooking the river moat, lit by floating lotus lanterns, the evening breeze carrying a subtle floral note. Because tonight, petals aren't just for palace banquets or medicine. They're instruments of diplomacy, delicate offerings exchanged between the Ming court and foreign envoys. You might imagine grand emissaries bribed with gold or silk, but in the 15th century, presenting exquisitely prepared peony dishes signaled respect and cultural sophistication. Feel your heart dance as a eunuch in indigo robes leads a procession of trays toward the pavilion, where the envoy, clad in mongrel silk robes, awaits eyes wide at the sight of petals shimmering in porcelain dishes. You recall how earlier in Section 7 petals infused grand feasts. Now they bridge nations. An elder eunuch in saffron steps forward, bearing peony diplomacy cakes, delicate rice pastries studded with candied petals, each gilded with a brush of gold leaf. He kneels and offers one to the envoy. You taste a piece, silky, sweet, with whispers of spring, bound to frost, soothing yet commanding attention. A mainstream historical fact, Ming records note that in 1417, when the Ryukyu envoy arrived in Nanjing, he was greeted with peony-decorated rice cakes, said to have set diplomatic talks on a harmonious path. Historians still argue whether those cakes truly shaped political alliances, or if they functioned more as courtly spectacle. Both interpretations endure in annals of Sino-Okinawan relations. Beside the cakes, a eunuch in teal places a delicate glass jar of peony cordial elixir on a silver tray. The envoy lifts it, inhaling petals suspended like rose-hued constellations. Spring in a sip, he murmurs through a translator. You watch as he offers the cordial to his retinue Roman noses and Central Asian tongues, tasting Ming's floral sophistication. A quirky tidbit survives that the Ryukyuan envoys once believed the cordial could grant prophetic dreams. Upon returning home, they claimed to foresee favorable tides for fishing. Scholars still debate whether these dreams were true visions or courtly embellishments intended to solidify the Ming's cultural cachet. But the legend underscores peony's soft power. Now, observe the eunuchs unveil peony silk sachet gift sets, elegant brocade pouches filled with dried petals and petal powders wrapped in boxes lacquered to resemble peony blossoms. The envoy's advisor lifts a sachet to his nose, closing his eyes as fragrance conjures invisible gardens. You might smirk a scent that shames perfumed Grand Dukes, but the sachets were treaty tokens, instructing envoys to carry peony essence home signified an ongoing bond. A mainstream historical fact official gift logs from 4ITEL 72 show that peony confectionery in sachets formed a significant portion of Ming tribute gifts to Southeast Asian polities. Historians still argue whether such gifts functioned primarily as tokens of goodwill or practical trade goods with aromatic value, yet their frequency in records marks them as diplomatic staples. Feeling the friction of soft silk, you watch an elder eunuch demonstrate peony inkstone carving miniature petal motifs in black inkstone presented alongside petals. The envoy scribes dip their brushes into peony-infused ink, producing calligraphy that smells faintly of blossoms. You recall earlier in Section 3 where petals symbolized imperial favor. Now, petals and ink combine to script new alliances. An obscure detail: some envoys believe the petal ink blessed written pacts with longevity, making treaties bloom like flowers for decades. Scholars still debate whether petal ink offered any preservative quality or served as poetic charm, but its practice is noted in diplomatic letters hosted in Beijing archives. Turning to another tray, you see peony-infused tea ceremonies set up beneath lantern-lit pavilions. Eunuchs in saffron robes guide the envoy's delegation through a ritual steeped petals layered with dragonwell tea leaves in porcelain jugs, then awakened by pouring water sourced from the imperial mountain springs. Each host and guest holds a cup, inhaling the rising steam. You remember from Section 5 that peony tea soothes palace ailments. Here, it soothes cultural frictions. A mainstream historical fact: Chinese maritime logs from the mid-15th century describe Arab envoys praising peony tea's floral depth, leading to early cross-cultural tea exchanges. Historians still argue whether these accounts romanticize Wahhabi pilgrims' encounters or reflect genuine admiration, but the recorded praise underscores peony's global reach. You shift focus to peony-embroidered silk scrolls, unfurled for envoy scrolls depicting peony gardens under moonlight, painted in mineral pigments and accented with gold leaf. These art gifts come with small vials of dried petals in color-coded tubes, red for generosity, white for purity. Envoys run fingers over embroidered petals, imagining the garden scent. You think scrolls that smell of peony's museum-quality multisensory art, yet these scrolls cemented cultural exchange. Envoys returned home with both art and aroma, echoing Ming's elegance. A quirky anecdote tells of one envoy whose silk scroll sprouted mold because petals trapped moisture, teaching eunuchs to include cedarwood chips in packaging. Historians still debate whether this was practical innovation or later embellishment, but evidence from 15th century logistical memoirs cites cedar chips as standard practice after a mold outbreak in 1458. Across the terrace, a eunuch in indigo presents peony-fired porcelain vessels, small cups and bowls fired with petal imprints that release their fragrance when hot liquids pass through. The envoy lifts a bowl from the fire pit, swirling warm broadleaf tea, and petals blush within the porcelain's grooves. You recall from Section 4 that artisans once carved peony motifs into garden rocks. Now, porcelain blessed by petal essence extends floral art to tableware. A mainstream historical fact, imperial kilns in Jingdejian produced peony-impressed ceramics in the 1420s revered for both beauty and subtle fragrance release. Historians still argue whether the scent persisted beyond a single brew or if its presence was overstated by court poets. But court inventories list hundreds of peony vessels used in banquet cycles. At the far end, a eunuch in saffron holds peony petal confession scrolls. Small silk slips with scented petals tucked within, inscribed with poetic couplets. Each envoy received a scroll containing a personalized poem, praising the envoy's homeland and pledging peony friendship. You might grin scrolls scented like ghost letters, but these poetic tokens carried deep meaning sealed with peony. They served as aromatic envoys of trust. A quirky story claims that a Korean envoy once slept with his scroll under his pillow to dream of peony gardens and returned with detailed motifs for planting peonies in his home palace. Historians still debate whether these accounts reflect genuine horticultural transmission or later romanticizations of diplomacy. But Korean palace records from 1482 mention new peony plantings inspired by fragrant envoy gifts. As moonlight bathed the pavilion, petals' fragrances collided rose musk jasmine, crafting a symphony of scent. Eunuchs offered final morsels of peony-laced porridge sweetened with rock sugar and sprinkled with golden petals. The envoy's retinue sipped slowly, eyes drifting to the reflected lanterns in their cups, petals floating like stars. You feel a hush settle as petals and politics entwine, a breakfast staple in Ming cuisine, here repurposed to foster trust. A mainstream historical fact, Ming tribute records from 1475 show peony porridge offered to eunuch envoys to soothe travel fatigue and signal magnanimity. Historians still argue whether the practice was strategic hospitality or a gesture of genuine care, but its repetition in records suggests intent. Finally, the envoy's leader stands and bows deeply. He presents a gift, a carved ivory box filled with foreign spices, peppercorns, cloves, and spiced sugars. Eunuchs receive it with reverence, offering peony sachets in return. This exchange of exotic spices and peony tokens cements cross-cultural dialogue, each item fragrant with meaning. You might think gifts that trade scents and flavors better than treaties, yet this ritual shaped trade networks that persisted for centuries. Historians still debate whether peony diplomacy facilitated maritime Silk Road shifts or remained ceremonial. But maritime logs recount how spices purchased with tribute silver funded new peony gardens in Suzhou, proof that petals and pepper fueled economies alike. As the envoy's boat drifts away under moonlight, petals swirl from the terrace into lotus-filled waters, echoing earlier memories of the gardens in Section 4. Courtiers whisper of peony peace, a fleeting harmony achieved through flower-season diplomacy. You step away, petals scent, lingering a reminder that in the Ming court, diplomacy bloomed through petals as much as words. Whether petals truly bent foreign hearts or simply created fleeting illusions, their role in forging alliances shines like a blossom afloat on the river's silver currents. You slip into the vaulted golden hall, where incense curls upward and rows of crimson pillars loom like sentinels. Tonight, the emperor hosts a grand imperial banquet to honor visiting provincial governors, and Peony Petals will suffuse the evening with sensory wonder. As you trudge past lacquered screens depicting peony-laden gardens, you feel anticipation tingle in your fingertips. Once the banquet begins, each dish will serve as a spectacle of visual opulence and aromatic allure. The hall's center boasts a circular dais, carved from sandalwood, upon which stands a massive rosewood table lacquered in vermilion and inlaid with mother of pearl. Around its perimeter, low stools upholstered in embroidered silk await dignitaries in indigo robes, their sleeves embroidered with silver dragons. Above chandeliers of gilded metal hang each shaped like a peony blossom, dripping with crystal prisms that catch lantern light and scatter prismatic blooms across marble floors. You might chuckle at peony-shaped chandeliers' overkill or ninth-level extravagance, but within this space excess underscores imperial might and cultural refinement. At the table center sits the first marble peony firework soup, a shimmering broth served in a massive jade tureen. Eunuchs in teal robes lift the turene's lid, and as rising steam meets cool air, petal-shaped essences shimmer like blossoms aflame. Each ring of color, white, crimson, and blush, swirls like miniature fireworks suspended in liquid. A eunuch dips a porcelain ladle, lifting a glimmering slice of translucent gelatin studded with micropetals. You taste it, gelatinous floral, with a hint of cinnamon, an unexpected spice introduced to accentuate petal's sweetness. A mainstream historical fact, court records from the mid-16th century mention floral fireworks, gelatins dyed in peony hues, as banquet centerpieces used to dazzle guests. Historians still argue whether cinnamon was originally part of the recipe or a later Canto import, but either way, the dish's shock factor remains unparalleled. Next appears Peony Carriage of Abalone, a large shell-shaped ginger-lacquered vessel inlaid with jade peony motifs. Inside, thin slices of abalone rest atop a bed of jasmine-scented peony petals, arranged to resemble a lunar carriage gliding across a petal sea. Eunuchs in indigo slide the dish forward, and court musicians strike chimes, their notes echoing off the hall's domed ceiling. You inhale the salty umami aroma mingled with floral perfume and think abalone atop peonies, royal surf and turf. But imperial menus prize this dish as a testament to imperial command over both land and sea, uniting mountain-scented petals and ocean's luxury. A quirky tidbit recounts that a certain Ming emperor insisted abalone be harvested only at dawn when tides were low to ensure no barnacle blemishes, reinforcing peony-like perfection. Historians still debate whether this abalone dawn edict was pragmatic for quality or theatrical for court legend. But court annals from 1554 mention the practice explicitly. As the abalone disappears, eunuchs unveil peony dragon ice, a colossal sphere of ice carved with dragon scales veined with frozen petals. Underfoot, cool mist drifts across the floor as lantern heat meets the ice's surface. Eunuchs in saffron pour a dollop of peony-infused honey into a shallow porcelain dish, then press the ice sphere onto the honey so that petals freeze momentarily in delicate patterns on its crest. When the ice starts to melt, like an ephemeral peony droplets land on plates, serving as a natural garnish for delicate dumplings. You wonder, ice and petals frozen spring in August, yet Ming records confirm such marvels during summer banquets to symbolize impermanence and beauty's fleeting nature. Historians still argue whether dragon ice was widespread or rare novelty, but surviving banquet inventories include entries for floral ice sculptures, suggesting it featured at least occasionally. As you brush aside silk tassels to glimpse the next dish, you see peony lotus crown pigeon paraded in on a silver tray shaped like lotus petals. The pigeon, roasted to bronze perfection, is perched on a crown of peony petals and lotus stems, symbolizing purity, crowning imperial strength. Eunuchs wield ornate forks to carve meat beneath a canopy of petals. The crowd gasps at each precise cut petals tumbling like confetti. Pigeon beneath a peony crown, true imperial pageantry, you think, but the dish also carried weight. Ming banquet records denote pigeon as a symbol of peace, and adorning it with petals signified the emperor's peaceful rule. A mainstream historical fact, pigeons appear in Ming court treatises as sacrificial birds representing unity. Historians still argue whether crowning them with peonies was symbolic embellishment or rooted in folk ritual. But banquet scrolls from the Jiajing Emperor's era confirm the practice in state feasts. Now, the hall dims slightly as attendants reveal a billowing cloud of steam, peony cloud dumplings. Each dumpling is shaped like a miniature peony flower, filled with minced pork and petals and steamed inside a translucent silk wrapping that dissolves upon steaming. Eunuchs in russet robes lift bamboo steamers, and the dumplings appear suspended in midair as if peony clouds formed from earth's rising aroma. You taste one airy, juicy, and floral, a delicate construction that evokes spring. A quirky story notes that one banquet guest once declared these dumplings so heavenly, he'd launched them skyward, an image immortalized in palace murals. Historians still debate whether silk-wrapped dumplings were an authentic Ming invention or borrowed from southern provinces, but surviving recipe scrolls from 1572 detail precisely how to fold petals into the dough. Beside that, you spot peony fire oxen, small cubes of beef, braised in a dark peony-tinged sauce, served over heated lava stones. Eunuchs place stones at each guest's doorstep, then set slow-burning charcoal beneath, releasing fragrant smoke. The beef, already tender, slides off skewers with minimal effort. Petals sprinkled over the meat ignite briefly on hot stones, sending a swirl of pink smoke like a miniature flame dragon. You think beef on smoldering petals feasts special effect department at work. But Ming culinary logs extol fire oxen for strengthening the body during cold months. Historians still argue whether peony fire techniques originated in imperial kitchens or regional folk festivals, but edicts from 1545 mention fire-oxidized meats as winter staples. A eunuch in teal then passes out small jade cups filled with peony dew sorbet, made from chilled petal-infused broths. The sorbet, pale pink and smooth, dissolves on your tongue like morning dew. You pause, sensing petal's essence, linger on your palate, a respite between courses. A mainstream historical fact, Ming banquet etiquette mandated sorbet interludes to reset taste buds between robust dishes. Some scholars still argue whether peony dew was standard or reserved for elite banquets, but treatises on royal ceremony list peony sorbet as a hallmark of state dinners. Next to the sorbet, you glimpse peony silver boat rice. The dish features glistening grains of glutinous rice molded into a boat shape, crowned with silver leaf and petals. A eunuch ushers the boat toward you, its hull shimmering. When you taste it, petals release subtle fragrance beneath silver's metallic whisper. Rice in a silver petal boat, an emperor's yacht for the palate, you think, but diplomat journals from 1587 record foreign guests marveling at this dish's artistry. Historians still argue whether silver leaf was purely decorative or believed to impart health benefits, but petal embellishments surely elevated presentation. As you near the edge of the dais, you encounter peony marshmallow saint skewers of sticky rice cakes, lightly torched to caramelize sugar, then dusted with peony powder. They appear as pale golden orbs, crowned with a dusting of rose pink. Eunuchs in indigo maneuver through the crowd offering skewers to guests who bite each morsel tasting char, sugar, and petals melded like a fleeting sunset. A whimsical tidbit claims that monks once offered similar cakes during spring festivals. These saints pay homage to that lineage while adding imperial flair. Scholars still debate whether religious origins influenced palace confections or if chefs simply appropriated popular treats. But festival chronicles from Anhui province mention similar marshmallows served during peony blooms. Finally, in a secluded corner of the hall, you spot peony candlelight porridge, a simmering cauldron of rice porridge infused with shredded petals, illuminated by nearby lanterns, whose soft glow makes the porridge shimmer like rose gold. Eunuchs ladle the porridge into small porcelain bowls gilded with petal motifs, offering them as end-of-banquet comfort food. You taste a spoonful warm, creamy, with a whisper of petals. Comfort distilled into a bowl. A mainstream historical fact notes that in Ming times, porridge was consumed at day's end to settle the spirit, and adding petals made it both healing and celebratory. Historians still argue whether peony porridge remained a peasant staple or rose solely to banquet status. But palace logs from the Zhengde emperor's reign mention it as a final course to signal goodwill before guests departed. As the final bowl circulates, the emperor lifts his cup and proclaims, "Let petals bloom in all hearts," prompting a chorus of assent. Courtiers bow petals drifting from dishes to floor like pink confetti. The lantern's glow dims as the emperor departs, leaving behind an echo of floral harmony. You trudge away from the dais, petals swirling underfoot each step, reminding you how imperial banquets wove peonies into every moment, blending taste, ritual, and power. In tonight's spectacle, petals weren't merely seasonings. They were symbols of imperial grandeur, diplomatic finesse, and sensory transcendence. You slip into the Imperial Library's scented pavilion, where carved columns of bamboo filigree cradle manuscripts bound in lotus-scented silk. Tonight, petals take center stage not on tables, but within lines of verse as scholars recite peony poems to accompany palace banquets. You trudge to a low dais where a circle of court literati, robed in indigo and teal, holds calligraphy brushes poised over scrolls. Each waits to inscribe verses celebrating peonies' fleeting beauty and their power to season both cuisine and spirit. A eunuch in saffron robes pours fragrant tea into porcelain cups painted with peony motifs. He swirls the tea, releasing petal-scented steam that drifts like a calligraphic brushstroke across the marble floor. One scholar eyes bright as morning dew, dips his brush in ink infused with crushed peony petals, an aromatic pigment said to lend poetry an ethereal quality. Peony ink holds moonlight sigh. He murmurs, tracing characters onto a scroll. Qi hua yi shun zui chang tian. A gracious bloom in one breath intoxicates the eternal sky. You think ink so perfumed words must taste like spring. But in Ming literary circles, peony ink was both sensory delight and emblem of refined taste. A mainstream historical fact notes that Ming poets such as Yan Yu 1520-1590 favored peony-infused ink for composing seasonal verses. Historians still argue whether peony ink genuinely enhanced poetic inspiration or served as luxurious affectation. But court anthologies from 1572 include multiple references to petal-scented calligraphy. As the first poem concludes, a eunuch presents scrolls to each scholar, and a hush falls. You recall from Section 7 that peony jelly dazzled courtiers' palates. Now, peony ink dazzles their minds. The next scholar, clad in russet and teal robes, recites lines woven from pluck petals and moonlit gardens. Ying ri hong zhuang mon yuan. Chun beneath sunlit glow red robes fill the garden spring. Her voice rises as she describes petals drifting onto banquet dishes. Each course serves a verse, each petal a stanza. You might smile at poetry, so entwined with dinner gourmands verses on a plate. But in the Ming court, literary cultivation and culinary art were inseparable. Some literata even claimed a well-placed poem could transform a simple peony garnish into an everlasting memory. Across the pavilion, another scholar in indigo rises, his manuscript bound in petal-patterned silk. He clears his throat. Peony wine flows redder than dusk's final sigh. Each goblet awakens hidden echoes in the heart. As he recites, eunuchs move through rows of low tables, offering goblets of peony-infused rice wine. You accept a cup, its crimson liquid shimmering like liquid rose petals, and feel warmth spread through your chest. The scholar's poem and the wine's fragrance entwine, each granting nuance to the other. A quirky tidbit holds that some courtiers believed sipping peony wine from a cup painted with lunar motifs allowed one to glimpse future destinies. Scholars still debate whether those tales reflect genuine divination practices or fanciful court rumors. But lyric anthologies from 1589 reference such mystical sips. Now focus on peony scroll contests. Eunuchs unfurl scrolls depicting calligraphic scripts cascading like petals across silken backdrops. Two scholars face off, one in teal, the other in saffron. Each is tasked with composing an impromptu peony poem under moonlight and inscribing it with petal-infused ink. The courtyard's stone lanterns cast gentle illumination, revealing dew-laden peony blossoms in garden beds nearby. You watch as brushes dance across paper lines of verse, appear praising petals' perfume, lamenting their impermanence, weaving metaphors of love duty and palace nostalgia. The contest audience, robed courtiers and eunuchs, listens intently, comparing subtle metaphors and brushstrokes. A mainstream historical fact confirms that such poetic duels among literati were popular late Nanling Dynasty gatherings intended to cultivate refinement and esprit de corps. Historians still argue whether these contests influenced palace menus. Did a winning verse ever alter a dish's seasoning? But records mention a contest in 1557 where the victor's white petal ode prompted chefs to create a new white peony dumpling blending poetry and gastronomy in real time. As dusk deepens, a eunuch in indigo removes scrolls and replaces them with peony garden gazebo seating mats. Each mat is embroidered with peony blossoms and inscribed with lines from famous imperial odes reminding guests of peony's storied place in dynastic lore. Scholars and dignitaries recline holding tulip-shaped wine cups. You settle onto a mat, the silk cushion cooling beneath you. The courtyard's peony trees arch overhead, their blossoms glowing under the lantern light as if reflecting the calligraphic lines just inscribed. You feel enveloped in a living poem, each petal and character singing a shared melody. Next, a eunuch presents Peony Poetry Compendium, a bound anthology, showcasing 84 poems written over the past decade. The first page features a foreword by the grand historian praising peony's dual role in court ceremony and scholarly pursuit. Within each petal lies the weight of an empire's grace, each verse a testament to our lineage. The envoy from Zhejiang province flips pages reverently nodding at verses he once memorized during earlier visits. You recall a fringe belief that memorizing peony poems bestowed unspoken grace upon one's bearing, lending an imperial aura. Scholars still debate whether such claims reflect genuine social dynamics or later romanticism, but court letters from 1602 include references to petal poets' blessing as a credential when appointing hastily gathered scribes. As night deepens, a eunuch invites each scholar to inscribe final lines on a massive peony unity scroll, a single piece of white silk stretched across an ebony frame. One by one, scholars approach a line for prosperity, another for peace, yet another pleading petals to shade our empire against folly and discord. Each verse weaves into the next, forming a continuous tapestry of ink and intent. When the final character is drawn, Wei Wei Guo Yun Ru Hua Kai Mei, our nation's fortune bloom lofty as the Peony Eunuchs. Seal the scroll with red cinnabar seals shaped like peony buds. A hush follows. The assembled literati bow before the scroll. In Section 5, petals were sorted and washed. In Section 7, they seasoned grand dishes. Now in Section 12, petals animate poetry and diplomacy's art of words. You sense how petals' fragrance transcends flavor, curling into calligraphy and rhetoric binding minds as much as taste buds. Historians still argue whether peony poems influenced political decisions or simply reflected courtly vanity. But this scroll, stretching like a river of ink, attests that peonies shaped the Ming Dynasty's literary soul. As the pavilion empties and scholars depart, petals flutter from trees overhead like ink droplets in wind. A eunuch in teal gathers the compendium and places it in the imperial archives, ensuring future generations can read verses born under lantern glow. You turn away petals underfoot, whispering of beauty verse and the ephemeral grace that shaped palace culture. In this space, peony poems offered more than praise. They served as living threads, weaving literary legacy, moral instruction, and culinary delight into the fabric of Ming court life. You slip into the verdant palace gardens at dawn, dew dripping from peony petals like liquid pearls, and the symphony of birdsong greets you. In this tranquil moment, petals leave tables and scrolls behind, becoming living botanical treasures that palace horticulturists cultivate with near reverent devotion. You trudge along stone pathways flanked by rows of carefully tended peony bushes, each cultivar trained over polished bamboos, its blossoms unfurling like imperial robes embroidered with nature's finest threads. These gardens supply petals to palace kitchens, apothecaries, and scholars alike. But beyond their utilitarian purpose, they embody Ming Dynasty aesthetics and eco-conscious philosophy. Feel the cool morning breeze carry the fragrance of hundreds of peony blooms as you approach a gardening pavilion where a eunuch in saffron holds pruning shears made of polished iron. Selective harvest he intones, snipping only the finest blossoms for petal collection. You recall from Section 5 how petals undergo rigorous sorting. Now in Section 13, you witness the horticultural genesis of those petals. Petals destined for culinary use come exclusively from the moonlit white cultivar prized for its slender petals and crisp fragrance. A mainstream historical fact notes that Ming imperial records document over 120 peony cultivars by the mid-16th century, each valued for distinct colors, petal shapes, and fragrance profiles. Historians still argue whether court horticulturalists bred new varieties intentionally or simply preserved regional heirlooms. But these gardens' biodiversity attests to a sophisticated system of botanical exchange. As the saffron-robed eunuch places snipped blooms into a wicker basket lined with lotus leaves, a younger apprentice kneels to examine the root systems of the bushes. He murmurs to himself, "Ensure proper drainage. Peony roots abhor standing water." You might smile at bathing blossoms for banquets, drowning roots in wisdom. But peonies require well-drained soil to flourish knowledge horticulturists gleaned experientially over generations. A quirky tip passed down mixing river sand from Shenyang with garden soil enhanced drainage and imparted faint mineral notes to petals. Scholars still debate whether this sand mixture boosted fragrance through micro-mineral absorption, or if the effect was psychosomatic. But palace gardeners swore by the practice. You follow the main path deeper into the garden where a series of raised earthen beds display peony specimens labeled in both Chinese characters and Manchu script, reflecting the court's multi-ethnic fabric. A eunuch in indigo kneels before a bed of crimson imperial blush peonies, his gloved hands brushing soil away to reveal tuberous roots. He gently ties bamboo stakes to guide stems, preventing heavy blooms from collapsing. This trellising ensures blossoms rise at head height for easy harvesting. You might think stakes and stakes, poling roots and pollination, but 15th century horticultural manuals describe trellising as essential, noting that stems left unsupported often snapped under bloom weight, losing both petals and prestige. Historians still argue whether trellising was originally imported from Central Asian gardens or arose indigenously, but its ubiquity in imperial records indicates adoption by mid-Ming. Adjacent to imperial blush lies a small rectangular pond where peony roots once immersed in clear spring water, a quenching ritual to induce stronger fragrance. Eunuchs drape auspicious red ribbons over branches to invoke good luck. A fragrant breeze ripples the pond's surface, and you spot fish gliding beneath water lilies. This micro-ecosystem maintains humidity levels that benefit nearby royal pink peonies. A mainstream historical fact reveals that Ming agricultural treatises recommended planting water features near peony beds to moderate microclimates, preventing heat stress in summer. Scholars still argue whether this practice aimed primarily to enhance fragrance or served as aesthetic alignment with feng shui principles. But the result yields robust blossoms scented enough for palace use. You step onto a gravel pathway toward the scholar's arbor, a pavilion nestled among golden peony trees whose blossoms appear gilded in morning light. Underneath, eunuchs gather to cross-pollinate flowers, transferring pollen with fine brushes. Their actions shape next year's blossoms, breeding peonies to produce larger petals or deeper hues. You think palace scientists in saffron robes, Darwins in slippers, yet cross-pollination reflects systematic botanical breeding. A quirky anecdote cites an early Ming horticulturist who attempted to cross silver veil and crimson crown peonies, hoping to create a violet-hued cultivar. The experiment produced pale mauve blooms, but never gained imperial favor. Historians still debate whether this cross succeeded or if it remains a fanciful tale, but records mention unprecedented mauve varieties by late Yuan, hinting at early mixing attempts. Beyond the arbor, you glimpse the heirloom verge where ancient peony stumps line a meandering path. Some stumps date to the founding of the Ming Dynasty, tended by eunuchs who once served under the Hongwu Emperor. A black lacquered plaque marks one emperor's gift stock, said to have been brought from Luoyang in 1368 and planted at the first palace grounds. Eunuchs approach respectfully sprinkling offerings of rice wine and crushed petals at each stump's base, an act both horticultural and ritualistic. You recall from Section 3 that petals symbolize imperial privilege. Here, roots symbolize imperial continuity, grounding a dynasty in living lineage. A mainstream historical fact reveals that horticultural genealogy was meticulously recorded with scrolls tracing each cultivar's lineage back to fabled origins. Historians still argue whether these root lineages were accurate or embellished to confer grandeur, but the presence of ancient stumps signifies reverence for botanical heritage. As the sun climbs, you reach a small greenhouse where apprentices nurture potted peony seedlings destined for new palace expansions. Eunuchs in teal carefully transplant young shoots into porcelain pots filled with the famed drifting cloud soil, black loam, imported from Anhui province, reputed to be peony's ideal medium. You kneel to inspect a pair of seedlings, noting their red-tinged leaves. A eunuch taps his chin and muses, "These may yield the firebird bloom next season, rare bird-shaped petals that curl upward." You might think bird-shaped petals peonies auditioning for avian roles, but Ming horticultural annals mention Jinyao peonies whose petals resembled flying cranes. Scholars still debate whether bird-shaped cultivars were naturally occurring mutations or the result of careful grafting. But poetry from the Wanli Emperor's era romanticizes these heavenly birds dancing in palace winds. Nearby, a curator eunuch in russet robes shows you peony tome shelves, climate-controlled cabinets preserving pressed petals and sketches. Each page pairs botanical drawings with notes on harvest dates, soil conditions, and fragrance profiles. A scholar in indigo peruses pages tracing a finger over a drawing of summer shower pink, lamenting that its fragrance wanes without precise soil, pH. A quirky note scrawled in the margin reads, feed the soil morning dew, and the petals weep for more. Historians still argue whether such notes reflect genuine horticultural knowledge or poetic fancy, but the codex's detail underscores a systematic approach to garden management. As noon approaches, a procession of eunuchs in indigo and teal carts arrives, each carrying freshly pruned peony blossoms from the walled gardens beyond. Guard eunuchs in crimson tasseled helmets clear a path, ensuring petals arrive unharmed. You follow to a staging area where petals destined for today's banquet and apothecary are sorted by weight and color, reminding you of Section 5, then sealed in cloth sacks. A eunuch in saffron labels each sack with banquet use fourth moon, day 10, or apothecary use petal powder for takviva. You witness petals' dual destinies, some destined for culinary spectacle, others for medicinal crucibles reflecting garden centrality to palace function. Before you depart, you pause at a small well where eunuchs draw water for temple rituals. They scoop water into porcelain basins and release hand-picked petals, performing head chants to honor Earth's spirits. The petals drift toward the well's dark surface petals, swirling before sinking. Petals return to their spring. One eunuch murmurs, head bowed. A mainstream historical fact notes that Ming horticultural philosophy embraced cyclical renewal petals, harvested offerings, made nutrients, returned to earth, a practice intertwining ecology and ritual. Scholars still debate whether this reflected early conservationist thought or purely cosmological ritual, but the act ensures palace gardens thrive. As you exit through the lotus-lined gate petals underfoot, stick to your shoes. You trace pathways where earlier you tasted petal wines, saw petals enshrined in scrolls, and sampled succulent petals in banquet kitchens. Now, in Section 13, you've traced petals to their garden roots, witnessing cultivation's art and ritual's grace. History's whisper floats on breeze. Petals plucked with care ensure petals feed many gates. In these gardens, petals breathe life into palace cuisine, literature, medicine, and diplomacy, their roots anchoring an empire's legacy in living soil. You step into a cool, shadowed granary annex where rows of bamboo racks ascend like shelves in a library, each holding meticulously arranged peony petals in various stages of drying. The late afternoon sun filters through latticed windows, casting light on petals that once adorned banquets, now suspended in a silent saga of preservation. In this hushed realm, eunuchs become archivists of flora, rescuing petals from each fleeting bloom so that their essence endures throughout seasons. As you trudge deeper, you feel the grain-scented air rustle with floral memory, an olfactory archive whispering of springs past. In the foreground, a eunuch in indigo robes inspects a rack of freshly picked crimson petals from the emperor's blush cultivar. He lifts a corner of silk underlay to reveal petals soft as velvet, yet already curling at edges, signs that moisture retreats. These petals are destined for VIP uses, embellishing imperial coronation cakes 6 months hence. Behind him, another eunuch in teal kneels before a cluster of pale, moonlit white petals, gently separating each from lingering dew droplets. You might smirk. Dry petals like ancient scrolls, only more fragrant. But in Ming foodways, proper drying is a sacrament. Any misstep risks mold or loss of fragrance, akin to fading lore. a mainstream historical fact. Ming horticultural treatises emphasize sun-drying petals for exactly 2 days, then transferring them to shaded racks for 3 more, maintaining consistent airflow rigorous protocols, still debated in modern botany circles. Moving left, you spot heat bed chambers, small vaulted rooms heated subtly by embers beneath stone floors. Eunuchs in saffron robes use bamboo tongs to place shallow porcelain trays of petals atop warming stones. The faint heat ribbons through petals, accelerating desiccation without scorching. You recall from section 13 that petals prized for culinary use require gentle sun drying. Here, chamber drying preserves petals during overcast autumn weeks. You taste the memory of petal tea, earthy, floral nuanced, knowing these processes preserve that complexity. A quirky tidbit survives that a certain eunuch once misjudged ember heat, brewing petals into brittle shards that crumbled like autumn leaves. Undeterred, he painted the shards gold, marketing them as golden autumn petal flakes for court artists. Historians still argue whether this artistic salvage was profitable or merely a court jaupe, but the anecdote underscores eunuch's resourcefulness. Beyond the chambers, you find the smoke-curing alcove, where delicate bundles of petals hang above smoldering pine needles. The smoke curls through petals, bestowing a faint resinous warmth ideal for winter's savory stews. A eunuch in indigo rotates the hanging bundles with bamboo poles, ensuring even exposure. Smoke-cured petals lend depth to preserved meats, he explains. You think petals smoked like fish floral bacon for the palate, but Ming culinary lore affirms that smoke-cured petals imparted nuanced warmth to cured meats and pickled vegetables. A mainstream historical fact suggests that smoke-curing petals likely emerged from northern provinces where wood smoke was common. Historians still debate whether this practice was temple-inspired, imitating incense, or purely culinary innovation, but palace records from 1540 list smoked peony petals under preserved goods. Next, a eunuch in teal invites you to the salt plunge trough, a long stone basin filled with fine sea salt. He gently layers imperial silver petals atop salt sprinkling more until petals lie suspended between salt grains. Over days, the salt wicks moisture-preserving petals in crystalline suspension. You might chuckle, petals buried in salt like flowers in a salty tomb. But salt-curing petals prevents bacterial growth and retains fragrance far longer than sun-drying alone. A quirky anecdote describes an overzealous eunuch who retrieved salt-cured petals too soon, finding them as salty as ocean foam. His tart misstep seeded palace humor for months. Historians still discuss whether salt curing originated in coastal provinces or was a palace innovation. But official granary inventories note salted petals shipped to remote mountain retreats for winter festivals. As you move on, you enter the herb blend vault, where petals destined for medicinal uses combine with powdered roots, cinnamon bark, and licorice slices. Eunuchs in saffron robes stir large porcelain jars, layering petals and herbs to create seasonal essence blends. One jar holds spring thaw blend, mixing crimson dawn peony petals with fresh mint and old ginger shards to treat transitional chills. Another contains autumn rest blend, pairing golden empress petals with chrysanthemum and dried pear slices for soothing coughs. You taste a pinch of autumn rest, the pear's sweetness contrasts floral dryness, a gentle caress for a morning throat. A mainstream historical fact. Ming pharmacopoeias designate specific herb-petal combos for each season. Believing petals carried energetic signatures aligned with lunar cycles. Historians still debate whether discrete formulas emerged from empirical trials or philosophical theories of yin-yang. But these seasonal blends anchored medicine in natural rhythm. Just beyond you encounter the Pétré clay vessel row, heavy clay jars glazed in deep blue, each inscribed with the harvest date and cultivar. Eunuchs store roughly dried petals here, pressing earthen lids tightly and sealing edges with rice paste. This practice maintains humidity at controlled levels, preventing overdryness that could render petals lifeless. Clay's breath preserves petals. A eunuch in indigo tells you, tapping the jar as if greeting a long-lost friend. You smile at petals breathing in clay lungs, but Ming gardeners witnessed subtle moisture regulation jars, balanced dryness with minimal humidity preserving petal supple notes. Historians still argue whether pottery's premium came from kiln location or artisan guilds' prowess. But porcelain-like glazes suggest imperial patronage secured vessel quality. At the far end, a eunuch in russet robes addresses peony preservation scrolls, unrolling ancient manuscripts on low tables. Each list dates weather conditions and petal yields akin to agricultural ledgers. Harvest peaked on third moon's ninth day, 500 petals per branch, reads one. Another notes smoke curing commenced under autumn equinox, calibrating exact duration against lunar cycles. You think rows of numbers as poetic as petals, but such meticulous records ensured continuity. If next year's harvest failed, eunuchs could consult data to troubleshoot soil, pH, rainfall patterns, or pruning errors. A mainstream historical fact. Ming agrarian codices emphasize record-keeping as essential for sustaining variety crop yield and horticultural knowledge. Historians still debate whether granary scrolls were accessible beyond palace or guarded jealously, but anecdotes describe sharing select records with provincial administrations during famine relief efforts. After a final glance at drying racks, you exit through a jasmine-perfumed corridor, petals embedded in floor mosaics like ghostly imprints. You remember from Section 5 how petals required sorting. Now in Section 14, you've witnessed preservation's web from drying racks to salt bath, smoke to clay jars, each method designed to keep petals' essence alive. A lingering note petals survive beyond bloom, sustaining palace banquets, medicines, and poems through seasons of scarcity. Historians still argue whether seasonal preservation methods emerged from regional peasant practices repurposed at court or were strict palace inventions. But the thorough integration of horticulture, medicine, and cuisine affirms petals' central role. You step into early twilight, petals' faint whisper, guiding your path as you ponder how an empire's fate can hinge on each preserved bloom. Tiny vessels of memory sustaining tradition year-round. You wander through the Hall of Petals, its walls adorned with lacquer panels depicting cascading peony groves through the season's petals, swirling in spring rains, drooping under summer heat, curling in autumn's chill. Tonight, petals emerge not from fresh blooms or drying racks, but from memory blossoms, woven into the very fabric of Ming Dynasty identity. You trudge among display cases housing heirloom petal artifacts, silver filigree hairpins shaped like blooms, silk ribbons still embroidered with sun-faded petals, and a century-old lacquered box containing preserved petals from the Wanli Emperor's 32nd birthday banquet. Within these cases, petals remind you that blossoms can shape a dynasty's ethos as much as emperor's decrees. A eunuch in indigo robes strides toward you carrying a small scroll titled Chronicle of Petal Legacy. He unfurls it upon a marble-topped pedestal, revealing columns of calligraphy listing pivotal moments where petals intervened in history. The 1421 Lotus Peony Alliance in Annam, sealed by exchanging peony-laced honeycakes. The 1505 Scholars' Rebellion, quashed when peony oil poultices healed wounded officials, restoring order. And the 1582 Silkwood Treaty, brokered under a canopy of peonies and Suzhou petals floating like diplomatic butterflies. A mainstream historical fact reveals that Ming diplomatic archives reference peony-infused offerings more than once as pivotal gifts that thawed icy relations. Historians still argue whether these petal-mediated alliances were bona fide diplomatic breakthroughs or later romanticized anecdotes, but the recurring presence of petals in statecraft chronicles attests to their symbolic power. Turn left to the Petal Emblem Gallery, where royal seals crafted from peony resin and gold leaf rest under velvet cushions. Each seal's imprint an intricate peony, surrounded by cloud motifs, once authenticated imperial edicts. You imagine a decree bearing a peony seal. By decree of the heavenly court, peony gardens shall be planted in every prefecture. You think a flower-bestowing bureaucratic power. Talk about botanical bureaucracy. Yet Ming administrative manuals confirm that peony emblems adorned official seals, signifying cultural prosperity. Scholars still debate whether peony stamps replace earlier bamboo motifs to align governance with floral symbolism or simply reflected palace fashion. But surviving edicts bear peony stamps as early as 1460. As you continue, the peony garden map spreads before you, a hand-painted scroll mapping all imperial peony gardens from Nanjing to Beijing. The scroll's legend notes each garden's founding date, cultivars grown and peak bloom periods. Eunuchs in saffron robes gather around pointing to the Emperor's Valley near Changping, where midnight rose petals glowed under moonlight so luminous they guided night patrols. A quirky tidbit persists that palace architects once installed reflective jade panels beneath midnight rose bushes to magnify petal glow, inadvertently spooking guards who thought ghostly blossoms moved on their own. Historians still argue whether midnight rose was a distinct cultivar or poetic metaphor for light-colored petals under moonlight, but palace travelogues from 1492 mention peonies burning like lanterns after dusk. Nearby, an interactive alcove invites visitors to smell jars of preserved petal compounds: Tang Dynasty Memory, Southern Breeze Imperial Blossom, each swirling a unique fragrance profile layered with musk, sandalwood amber, or rare woods. Eunuchs in teal guide you to close your eyes and breathe deeply. You inhale imperial blossom soprano notes of jasmine blending with deep peony heart, a fragrance once reserved for imperial marriage ceremonies. You recall from Section 4 that petals were flung at bridal palanquins to bless unions, and here centuries later the scent transports you back to those rituals. A mainstream historical fact confirms that Ming dowry inventories list bridal peony essence as essential for noble weddings. Historians still argue whether fragrance's potency faded quickly or if ancient distillation methods preserved long-lasting aromas. But palace perfumers swore by their techniques, and jars like these survive as scent-time capsules. Before you, the Peony Culinary Codex lies open, its pages splattered with petal residue sketches of dishes. From section 7 through section 11 soups with petals dancing like fireflies. Pheasant roasts crowned with petals, edible petal vessels of ice and honey. Eunuchs in indigo pass around a copy, each page annotated in fine brushstrokes indicating modifications for seasons. Add peppercorns in autumn, reduce ginger in spring, reads a note. You taste a drop of glaze from a carved wooden spoon, sweet floral with a subtle heat. This codex embodies centuries of culinary evolution, petals spiced, smoked, candied, and preserved. A quirky detail hints that one palace chef exiled for burning a batch of precious petals found redemption by creating the now celebrated peony spice rub, blending petals, Sichuan pepper, and roasted sesame seeds. Historians still debate whether this rub was a genuine invention or a courtly legend, but references in 1578 banquet menus suggest it existed. By late Ming, moved to the Peony Apothecary Scrolls, where ancient medicinal texts outline herbs that complement petals, peony to calm key angelica, to invigorate blood ginseng, to bolster spirit. A eunuch in russet robes offers a small folded scroll, midwinter petal, conserve a recipe combining petals, rock sugar ginger, and dried tangerine peel to ward off seasonal colds. You bite a crystallized fragment, ginger's warmth balanced by subtle floral sweetness. A balm for frost-bitten cheeks. A mainstream historical fact from the Ming Materia Medica suggests that midwinter petal conserve improved circulation and reduced phlegm. Scholars still argue whether such preserves cured actual ailments or simply provided nutritional comfort. But references in physician diaries from 1610 describe patients praising petal preserves over conventional tonics. Adjacent is the Peony Literary Archive, housing anthologies of Ming poems and essays extolling petals' virtues. One scroll quotes poet Yuan Hongdao, 1568-1610, "In June's haze, peony's breath lingers longer than spring's farewell." Another, by Xu Wei, 1521-1593, sketches peonies as fleeting love. A bloom's blush pales in moments, yet memory holds its flame. Eunuchs lead you to a digital touchscreen, a modern edition displaying translations alongside original calligraphy. You scroll through poems, each line like a petal cast upon time. A quirky footnote explains Xu Wei wrote his poem while high on peony wine, prompting debate. Did petals inspire poetic fervor or merely lubricate creative inhibitions? Historians still argue whether Ming poets wrote in genuine floral reverie or leaned on potion-induced bravura. But the archive preserves layers of poetic complexity. You approach the peony silk vestments, display robes woven in brocade with petal motifs, stoles dyed with petal extracts that shimmer in lantern glow, and sashes scented with petal-infused oils. Eunuchs demonstrate how wearing petal-dyed silk during spring festivals brought auspicious omens, petals symbolizing renewal wrapped around noble torsos. You might imagine petal-dyed fashion next season's trend, but Ming court fashion codices dictated specific petal colors for mourning weddings and official ceremonies: white peony for grief, blush pink for concubine inaugurations, deep crimson for accession ceremonies. Historians still debate whether dyeing methods came from coastal dye merchants or palace workshops innovated them, but martial edicts from 1588 specify punitive stripes removed so peony dyes wouldn't offend military ranks, highlighting Petals' political weight. Toward the back, the Peony Memorial Shrine stands a simple altar of wood carved with peony petals, where eunuchs offer garlands of dried petals to honor past emperors and horticulturists whose hands coaxed peonies from soil. A eunuch in teal bows, placing a garland before a plaque etched to generations who made petals eternal. You feel reverence stirring, recalling each chapter. Petals plucked for banquets, brewed for medicine, inked for poetry, grafted for gardens, dried for posterity. A mainstream historical fact recognizes peony gardens as core to Ming Palace culture. Inscriptions on steles from 1620 eulogize peony luminaries who bridged nature and empire. Historians still argue whether memorialization was sincere homage or court performance, but in this shrine, Petals' symbolic gravity feels undeniable. As twilight descends, you realize petals have transcended seasons and uses, becoming an axis around which Ming court life revolved. Each heading in chronicle of petal legacy, diplomacy, cuisine, medicine, poetry, horticulture, preservation intersects here at the shrine, reminding you petals wove unity through disparate domains. You think petals more powerful than armies if only wars ended over flower exchanges, yet Ming-worth scholars concede peony diplomacy mitigated conflicts at borders. You pause before leaving, touching the shrine's carved petals, smooth, cool wood, echoing living blooms. The eunuch in saffron whispers, "Petals endure beyond bloom, they tell our story." You step away, petals echo, lingering like a final verse in the wind. Let your vision soften as moonlight filters through lattice windows, bathing the granary annex and gardens in a silvery glow. You've journeyed with petals from vibrant gardens to imperial banquets through scrolls of poetry, archives of medicine, and halls of diplomacy, tracing each blossom's path through palace life. Now feel the gentle hush settle upon your senses like petals drifting in a still pond. Allow every thought of lavish feasts and ceremonial calligraphy to fade into a tender memory remembered as softly as petals settling onto glassy water. Each swirl of fragrance, every brushstroke of ink, once carried urgency and grandeur. Now they recede into a calm rhythm, petals pulse, echoing your own breath. In this moment, recognize that petals represent more than flavor or beauty, they embody cycles of life, echoes of history, and the delicate interplay between nature and human ambition. Consider how petals survive beyond their bloom, preserved in manuscripts dried on racks or inhaled as fragrant sachets. They bridge seasons, heal wounds, and inspire verse whispering of an empire's rhythm, and the hands that tended each garden and composed each poem. Even as petals fade, their essence remains guiding apprentices, tracing recipes, historians debating origins, and future generations who will gather blossoms at dawn. So, as your eyelids grow heavy, allow petals' gentle fragrance to cradle your mind. Imagine a single blossom's journey from bud to bloom, plucked by careful hands, brewed in steam, brushed as ink planted in soil, and finally preserved as memory. Let that journey lull you into rest, knowing tomorrow's dawn will bring new petals, new stories, and the quiet assurance that some beauty endures across centuries and dreamscapes alike. End of script. Sweet dreams.